used to like to go exploring in the woods. Not anymore. My name is Jake Somerville. My mom and dad both have advanced degrees in agricultural sciences, whatever that means. They would survey land, crops, sometimes even the local wildlife. I wasn't sure what exactly it was they did, but I knew it was why we moved around a lot. I didn't mind though, after all, I liked exploring, sometimes pretending I was Indiana Jones searching for some lost, ancient civilization. Sure, I've had my fair share of close calls, but nothing serious ever happened to me. At least, not until we moved to a small town in Missouri. I don't remember the name of it due to the mental trauma I experienced, or so my psychiatrist says, but I do remember Zach Mays. Zach was 9 years old that summer, the same age as me. He was into a lot of the same things I was, especially exploring. I met him when my parents moved into this farmhouse. It wasn't big or fancy or neat like the usual houses we rented, but it had a sort of rustic charm to it. Zach's parents owned the land the house was on and the property next door, where they lived. They were friendly enough, even offering to help my parents get settled in. As they were handing the house keys to my parents, Zach came around the corner, held out his hand, and announced who he was. I was never the one to make friends, what with the constant moving around and whatnot, but something about Zach just clicked. We had moved at the start of summer break, so Zach and I had plenty of time to play. We'd mostly go exploring, capturing small animals and releasing them back into the wild. We had all of 4 acres to ourselves, except for the area near the edge of the property line. That was the start of the woods. Naturally, both of our parents forbade us from going in there, but we did anyways. We'd clear our own trails, pretending we were in a lush jungle. One time, Zach swore he saw a copperhead, but we never did find it. At first, we'd stay relatively close to the edge, but as time went on, we became more relaxed. Before long, we were trekking deep into the woods, able to find our way back with markers we'd given names to. One day, at the edge of the property line, we came across a patch of woods that were different somehow. Darker, thorn bushes were common in the woods, but this place was completely covered in them. In fact, it was so thick we couldn't hope to gain entry. We walked around it for what seemed like hours, but never did find a way past those thorns. As time passed, we forgot about that place in the woods. After all, there was so much left to explore. To my delight, my parents told me that we were going to be here for a while, something to do with anomalies in the surrounding forest. Zach and I ended up in the same classes, and before we knew it, we were fast approaching Halloween. The forest, which was once green and beautiful, so full of life, had transitioned into a graveyard of fallen leaves and claws reaching despairingly into the sky. It was like they were begging the sky to return the leaves to them. On October 30th, Zach was staying over at my place for the night. It was just the 2 of us in the middle of nowhere. Our parents had gone to some boring adult dance party where kids weren't allowed. We were sitting on the floor in front of the TV, watching horror movies, when out of nowhere Zach elbowed me in the side. Scowling, I asked him what the big deal was, and his face lit up. "Do you remember that thorny part of the forest?" he asked. "Yeah," I replied. "Why? Let's go in there. Everything's dried up. We can cut through those thorns easily now." I was hesitant first. Something about that idea seemed off, seemed wrong. But I didn't want Zach to think I was a chicken, so reluctantly, I agreed. We grabbed our backpacks, stuffing them with supplies for our adventure. Zach placed a pair of garden shears and a spare flashlight in his, while I grabbed a map of the area, some batteries, and an extra flashlight for mine. We then grabbed our jackets and a pair of flashlights, then headed out the door towards the woods. The moon was blood red and full that night, bathing everything in that eerie hue. It was almost as if the very earth itself were stained with blood. It had been a while since either of us had been in the woods, what with school and all, but we found our landmarks with ease. I didn't know it at the time, but those landmarks would save my life. Before long, we were at the edge of the property line, staring at that part of the forest which we've never been able to enter before. "Look, they're gone," exclaimed Zach. Sure enough, the thorn bushes had vanished. It was almost as if the forest itself wanted us to enter. There was something foreboding about this part of the forest. While the surrounding trees stretched their branches outwards in all directions, The trees in front of us grew closely together, their branches reaching inwards into the darkness. I felt a chill run down my spine, and suddenly I didn't want to go in there anymore. Zach must have felt it too because he shivered for a moment. We flipped on our lights and peered into the darkness. Upon closer inspection, the thorns were still present. They just were cleared to form a path into the woods. Zach knelt down, a puzzled look on his face. I don't see any tracks, human or animal, going into the forest, Zach said. We concluded that someone or something must have cleared that path some time ago. Whatever had, it didn't look like it was still around or had been back in quite a long time. I didn't like it. The way the trees were so unnaturally bent made me feel as if the forest were waiting to swallow us whole. As ghastly as that sounded, that wasn't the most disturbing part. What was disturbing was I felt compelled to go into those woods. Zach and I looked at one another before moving on. We walked in between the thick trees, our flashlights providing the only source of light in the otherwise pitch-black woods. The night was silent, spare for the sound the leaves made as we walked on top of them. I couldn't help thinking they sounded like bones crunching beneath our feet. Occasionally, the trees would part, allowing the moon's red hue to trickle down them like blood. I was relieved when we at last emerged from the forest into a clearing. The trees opened up to a flat field that had to be at least an acre, maybe more. The ground was barren, spare for a few trees here and there. In the middle was what appeared to be a lake. I had grabbed a map earlier and pulled it out of my bag. I had our property drawn on it with the woods circled. There were no bodies of water anywhere near our property on the map. I handed the map to Zach, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. We couldn't have walked for more than 5 minutes, I said. Zach looked as confused as I was. We tried to locate ourselves on the map, but aside from the lake, there were no other defining features. At that moment, my gut was telling me to go back, to get the hell out of there. But then Zach started walking towards the lake, so I followed. He reached it before I did and let out a gasp. "Dude, come look at this," he said in almost a whisper. It's not right." Those words would haunt me for the rest of my life. It almost felt as though my legs had a mind of their own, moving on their own accord. Before long, I was standing next to Zach at the edge of the water. It didn't take me long to see what he meant. Our reflections weren't in the water, but everything else was only different. A few trees grew along the shoreline, but what was reflected back was, well, I don't know what to call it. The trees, instead of being barren, were covered in what looked like flesh. It was then that I noticed we weren't the only things not reflected on the water's surface. The sky, blood moon and all, was also absent. In its place was a seemingly endless black void. "That's so weird," Zach mumbled. Zach's voice freed me from my trance. He walked along the bank until he found what he was looking for. A stick. "I don't think we should be here," I said to Zach, but he just ignored me. It was as if something was making him pick up that stick. As Zach approached the surface, I saw the water move as if there was something just beneath the surface. I tried to call out his name, but no sound came out of my mouth. I just stood there, frozen to the spot, as he knelt down, prodding the surface of the water with the stick. He did this a few times, then stood up and looked at me. "It's just water," he said, taking a step forward. It was then he lost his balance and fell backwards into the water, a look of surprise on his face. I expected him to break the surface once the splash had subsided, but he never did. At first I thought he was fooling around, but seconds turned to minutes, and I realized he wasn't pranking me. I ran towards the spot where he had fallen into the lake, slowing as I approached the edge, not wanting to touch the surface. I shone my light into the murky depths, scanning for any sign of my friend. As I was about to give up, I saw it. Zach's flashlight was on, except it was near the entrance into the forest that was reflected in the water. I looked back at where we had entered, seeing no flashlight, but when I returned my gaze to the lake, there it was. It never crossed my mind to run back and call the police, and even if it had, what would I tell them? That my friend fell into a lake and was transported to some alternate nightmarish reality? Yeah, right, like they would believe me. I wouldn't have believed me if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. I began to shiver uncontrollably. It wasn't that it was particularly cold that night, it was the thought of what I had to do. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and placed it on the ground a few feet from the bank before taking my bag off. I unzipped it and stuck my hand inside the opening and pulled out the spare flashlight. I turned it on and laid it next to my phone, its beam pouring into the water. I didn't have a signal here, but I could get one near the barn, and I wanted it ready because, well, I had a very unsettling feeling. I slowly approached the water's edge, not knowing what to expect. I inhaled deeply and jumped in, feet first. What I felt next is hard to describe. It was cold, very cold, as if I had jumped into ice water, and I felt as though my insides were being torn inside out. It was like vertigo, but not quite the same. It was as if I had lost all my senses, including direction. When I emerged from the lake, I took a huge breath of stale, dry air. I climbed out of the water and looked around. I was there in the nightmare forest. Up ahead, I could see Zach's flashlight abandoned on the ground next to his backpack. I was about to call out his name when I saw them. The garden shears he brought lay broken in two on the ground, and each blade was coated in thick blood. I picked them up, not wanting to be out here defenseless. The forest was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The trees were covered in tendrils of flesh, wet and pulsing, as if alive. The world was dimly lit, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I looked up at the sky, but saw only darkness. No moon, no stars, just pitch-black darkness. I felt as though if I were to jump, I would be consumed by that darkness, and again the feeling of being swallowed whole rushed over me. As I walked, the forest floor made a mix of a squishing sound followed by a dull thud, as though there was metal beneath the flesh. I followed the path into the woods, headed back towards my house. Here and there were pieces of Zach's clothing stuck to the trees. It looked as if he was running from something. I made it out of the thicker forest, back into familiar territory, if you could call it that. All of our landmarks were there, albeit somewhat hard to make out due to the flesh. I was almost to the edge when I heard a blood-curdling scream. It was Zach. I ran faster than I thought I ever could, the foul air burning my lungs as I took short breaths. I slowed as I reached the clearing, unable to breathe. Parts of Zach's pants lay in tatters on the ground, with a large amount of blood leading towards the barn. The barn was a stark contrast to the forest. It was comprised not of wood, but of rusted metal, and though the tendrils climbed up the perimeter, they didn't extend more than maybe 3 feet. I approached the doors cautiously, holding a blade in each hand, and pushed them open. What I saw next I'd never forget. Zach's body was hung on a meat hook, its jagged edge protruding through his right upper chest. His shirt was soaked in blood, which traveled down his legs. His pants were shredded, and where his feet used to be were mangled lumps of meat with bits of bone sticking out at odd angles. It looked like something had chewed them off, and I shuddered at the thought of what did this to him. Beneath him was a steadily growing puddle of blood. I would have thought him dead had he not looked up at me. Slowly, he reached his left hand into his pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it out to me. As his arms stretched, he mouthed the words, "Get out," though all that came out his mouth was a gurgling sound followed by blood. I put the blades down and took it, then watched as my friend took his last breath. I looked at his phone and saw he had taken a picture of what had attacked him. It was human-like, but distorted. Its legs and arms were long and lanky, skin stretched thinly over bone. It had a small tail like what you would see on a tadpole. Its feet and hands both ended in 4 digits, each complete with long, sharp claws. Its spine protruded from its back and looked as if it would tear right though at any moment. It had a neck twice as long as a normal human with a round head at the end. It was facing downwards in the picture, so I couldn't see what its face looked like. I looked up and noticed that Zach wasn't the only one hanging in the barn. There were several bodies, each in varying stages of decomposition, hanging from hooks. Some were bones picked clean of flesh, while others looked as though they had been hanging there for months. At that point, I doubled over and threw up, and when I raised my head, I saw it. The creature. Its face was something straight out of a nightmare. Where its face should have been was a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth, sunken into the head. It kind of reminded me of the giant maw of the Kraken as it devoured one of Odysseus' ships. On either side were two small, beady black eyes as dark as the night sky. As it lunged at me, I fell backwards, my thumb hitting the camera button. A bright light flashed from the phone, and the creature stumbled backwards, emitting a horrible screeching noise that sounded like a dozen birds going through a meat grinder. I got to my feet and I ran, bolting from the barn into the woods, the creature still screeching madly. I heard multiple screeches echo from within the woods as I ran. Just how many of those things were out there, I didn't want to know. My body moved on autopilot, following the markers that Zach and I had followed so many times before. At one point, I saw one running at me on all fours from my right side. Instinctively, I took its picture. Glad to see trees that lead to the lake, I ran into sprinting as quickly as I could without falling over. As I made it into the clearing, I fell and felt a searing pain shoot down from my left leg into my foot. One of the creatures had dug its claws into me and was dragging me back into the woods. Zach's phone had fallen a few feet from me and I couldn't reach it. To my right was his bag with a spare flashlight sticking out from the top. I grabbed it. I never prayed so hard in my life like I did that night in the woods. Please God, let it work. Please God, let it work. I muttered as I pointed it towards the creature and flipped the switch on. Immediately, a beam of light shone from the flashlight directly into the creature's face. It released me, retreating back into the darkness, howling in pain. I half ran, half limped to the water's edge. All the while the screeches of the creatures grew in volume behind me. Reflected in it was my world. Trees without flesh, a sky alight with stars, and a forest devoid of those things. I didn't hesitate. I jumped into the water, not caring about the return of that vertigo feeling. I emerged from the surface and took in a deep breath of air that didn't taste like death. I pulled myself onto the shore and collapsed, panting. I laid there, listening for those creatures to break the surface, but they never did. I turned off the flashlight by my phone, put them in my bag, and began limping into the forest. As I made my way through the dark thicket, I heard the screeching of one of those creatures. I turned around, fumbling with the flashlight, and dropped it, causing the bulb to shatter. I turned and ran, not noticing the pain in my leg, and not stopping until I had reached the barn. With the adrenaline fading, I collapsed beneath the light above the doors. For a second, I could have sworn that I saw one of those things lurking in the woods. I wasted no time. I pulled my phone from out of my pocket and called the police, telling them my friend had been killed. I don't know how long I sat there. It felt like an eternity. I was beyond happy to hear the sirens as they approached. I don't remember much else of that night. I know my parents were there, pale as ghosts when they saw my leg as I sat in the ambulance. I saw Zach's parents there as well. His mother was on her knees, face buried in her hands, crying. His father just stood there, one arm on his crying wife, his face devoid of any emotion. At that point, it all became a blur. I awoke the next morning in the hospital, my parents asleep in the bed next to mine. Apparently, I had lost a lot of blood from my wound and had passed out. I remember feeling uneasy at the thought of having someone else's blood inside of me. The police questioned me and I told them everything. I told them about the forest, about the lake, the nightmarish worlds, and the creatures. I even told them how to find it. They didn't believe me, of course, and I had left Zach's phone back by the lake. They surmised that Zach and I were attacked by an animal, and after seeing it maul my friend to death, my mind, influenced by the Halloween movies, created that world to cope with the trauma. Nonetheless, the police formed a search party and went into the woods, searching for what remained of Zach's body. They never did find it, nor did they find that patch of woods that lead to the lake. It was as if that part of the forest simply disappeared. I had to take physical therapy as well as talk to a shrink regularly. My leg recovered, but I never stopped having nightmares from that night, even though it's been years since it happened. My parents didn't stay in that town long after that, and I was glad. I hated the looks the other kids at school would give me, or how they would keep asking what really happened out there in the woods. Now, whenever my parents have work, they make sure to rent a house in town, far from any nearby woods. Sometimes, though, late at night, I can hear that creature in the distant woods, screeching in a mix of anger and hunger. Hunger, for me. Second story. I crawl. Thirsty. Bitter. So bitter, but I must eat them. The things that grow. They came here in a recent time. The growths are bright. They have a neck, and there is a ball on top of that neck, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 round fans attached. Is this light? This light? This color? I don't know. It makes me think of algae, slime, and moss. I approach a patch of growth, and my feeder splits open. They dance when I wrap my tongues around them and rip them out. Bitter. Burning. Did they come here because they hate me? Why? I don't understand. But I feed. When I am finished, I crawl back down from the ceiling and lie down in a trickle of wet. The stream. The rocks are sharp and bumpy, but my skin shapes to fit, and my bones shuffle around so they can fit too. Pores open. I drink and I flush. The vines must hate me because they still hurt me after I eat them. They claw at my insides, but I relax and let my tubules slacken and droop out from my pores. They fan their plumes into the stream, and I can feel the hurt of the vines drain from my body. Then I eat again. I drain, drain, and eat until my membranes are swollen and full. After that, I can leave the bright and go back into the calm and the soft. I found a toy today. I did not bring it into the bright, but it feels hard and round, but also hollow. There are 2 round holes on the front and a row of dull pegs at the bottom. I think it's missing a part. I will bring it back to Mother and see what she thinks. It is a challenge to scuttle back down to where I sleep when I am so full. There is nothing else to be done though. The pointy tips of my legs strain and shiver and my joints ache. Stop. Smell. Send a pulse. I am at the deep well and I am relieved. The hard cuticle plates on my back pop and release, letting me curl into a ball. It is a strain to fit my swollen organs inside, but I do, and I roll forwards off into the shaft. It hurts to hit the ground again, but I am okay. I uncurl and follow the path home with sound and smell. Now, it is easy because Mother has started to smell very strong, and she hasn't moved in a long time. That makes me happy. My pedipalps sense a membrane ahead, which I carefully slice through, and when I am inside, I excrete from my glands to seal it back up. Mother, I ask, why won't you come and help me? And my sisters? I cannot hold off the bright all by myself. She is sleeping. I hope she will be okay. I nestle the new toy in her tail and curl up beside her. My sisters must still be outside. They will come back, I know it, so I sleep. We sleep. The growths do not taste good. They do not make me less hungry, so I still have to find food. For me, for Mother. My sisters are probably doing the same, I know, but the hunger is bad and the vines are bad. Below. Must go down. There are spiders and worms and curly bugs in the dry, but not many. Better to go below into the wet. I don't know how far down the world goes. It is filled with the wet because all the streams go there, and I can only breathe the wet for so long until I start to choke and drown. It is worth the risk. I catch lots and lots of crunchy bugs that can live in the wet, big or small, slender or stout. They are all very tasty. Sometimes they pinch me on the inside with their little claws after I have swallowed. They do not bother me like the vines do, but I get scared of getting stuck down in the wet. Not even Mother would know what happened to me. Mother. Yes, I hold some of the crunchy bugs in my feeder and carry them back home for Mother. I leave them by her and I start to feel bad because I know where I have to go next. Climbing the great well is always easier when I have eaten. I am up in no time and can already see the bright, like steam from the warm vents but cold. There is more. It doesn't make sense. I eat as much as I can, and when I come back, there's always more than the time before. I'm trying to stop it, but I don't know if I can, and I do the only thing I can think and eat, rip, and tear until I am unable. Flush out my pores, hurt is gone. Eat some more. Flush. Full. I go home again. Roll into the shaft and all the way down. I get half of the way back home to Mother, but the hurt has come back. I don't know why. Why is it hurting? I flush them out. Pressure builds inside me, up my foregut until I can feel it pushing out against my feeder. Cannot hold it. Feeder splits and bile and bubbling acid comes flooding out all over the ground. Bits of chewed vines float around in the puddle. I don't think they are dead yet, not all of them. They are still bright. Oh no, The bright, it's trickling down. Down the steep tunnel and down towards home. No, no, no. What if my sisters run into it? Will they hate me? Maybe they will help me. Maybe need to get home. I wake up. Where am I? Not home. I cannot smell mother. It is so bright and oh, no. No, please, no, no, no. The bits of growth that escaped me are still there, but there are more of them. They are spreading and they keep going in a line down the tunnel. I spring to life and claw my way up the walls and onto the ceiling, and I crawl towards home. I do not want to touch the growths. I can't anymore. They are scary. Keep going. The bright shows me something at the side of the tunnel. I think it's one of my sisters, but she isn't moving and she is very, very thin. The bright must have frightened her terribly. I cannot get her to move and come home with me. I will leave her for now. It is good to see you. Finally, I reach the end. They haven't reached my home, and when I pass them and go around a few corners, I cannot see the bright anymore. Mother is still here. Mother is okay. It's okay. For now, it is okay. Don't worry about the bright, mother. I will hold them back. Sleep. Wake up. Dive into the wet and catch food. It is much easier to catch the crunchy bugs. They aren't fighting back as much. I don't know why. They just feel weaker and they have a sour taste. Climb out. Eat. Bring food to mother, then climb back up the tunnels, up the great shaft to the bright. When I get there, I see the bright hasn't grown much further, and I feel better. Still, I have to keep going until they leave my world forever. Before I start ripping them up, I freeze. A noise. I've never heard this noise before, so it frightens me. It sounds loud and heavy and... what is that? Oh, no, no, no. Please no. The above has broken apart, smashed through. Something's up there. Strange creatures I've never seen before. They look terrifying. All fleshy and moving on two legs. Hard, colorful, shiny shells on their heads and bodies lined with silvery strips that blind me. I have to get away, run away, get away. But I can't move. I'm too scared. The big pointy spiral is ripping apart the rock above me. The above, the world is broken and collapsing, and the creatures are pointing down at me. They're going to eat me. Go! I whip around and scamper away, and the hard clacking of my legs has never been so loud. The ground shivers again. A sound like the world exploding, and I am showered in rocks and boulders. Faster. Nearly there. I am nearly at the shaft, and then I can go home and rest with mother, and a big heavy rock lands on my lower body. So heavy and with a crushing force. It hurts. It hurts so much worse than the vines ever hurt me. Luckily, it rolls off me and I disappear into the tunnel. Fast as I can. I am terrified. It hurts so bad, but I want to live. I don't want to get eaten. I don't remember how I got home. 6 or maybe 8 or 9 of my back legs won't move. They won't listen to me. It does not matter though. They are broken and twisted and my spine is crooked. I remember falling down the shaft, but I couldn't roll into a ball and it hurt even more. I'm leaking. You still won't help me. Please, mother, it hurts. Stop it hurting. Sisters. Sleep, yes. The sleep will make it go away. Sleep heals. Sleep. I do not wake up. No, it is something else that wakes me. Something that isn't me. I'm not sure what it is at first until I roll my joints and look to the door of my home. Not the bright, but the suggestion of it. It is near. I try to get up on my feet. Instead, I crash back down. That's right. My back legs are ruined. So I drag myself to the door and cut through membrane. The second I exit, I collapse from fright. The bright is here. Just right outside, grown all the way down from the tunnel up. No, what did I do to them to deserve this? I can't remember a long time after that. Panic. Rip. Tear. Scream. When I am back, I see that most of the bright is ripped up. I don't know if it's dead though, so I scoop up as much of it as I can and slide down to the wet. I dive in, down as deep as I can go, and dump the vines. I'm too weak, so it isn't very far into the wet where I dump them. Everything hurts. I hurt. The water hurts, it burns. I climb back out of the wet. Hard to breathe. My spiracles are blocked with pus and lifeblood. I'm so tired and I want to sleep forever. When I get home, I freeze again and start to cry out. There are echoes from up the tunnel. Bad noises. The 2 legs monsters are coming with their giant claw or tooth, and another rumble. A loud blast. They are closer than I thought. I can see dust falling from the above. I can't let them, I won't let them take Mother. How to hide? How? I know. I move up the tunnel a bit and start secreting out of my neck glands. First, a membrane from side to side, up to down until the membrane blocks the tunnel. Then I do it again and again and again until it is so tough I can't slice through it. When my glands run out, I crawl around the membrane, licking it with all my tongues so it can start hardening. It's hard. I can only move with my front legs, but I do it anyway. When I am too tired to go on, the membrane is already looking and feeling stony, just like the walls of the tunnel. I still sense the bad noises, but I can't hear them, and I can't see the bright on the other side. We are safe now, Mother. She is still sleeping. So tired. I will sleep next to her. I think I slept for too long. At least the bright didn't wake me this time. Hungry. My body is pulsing and it's hot. My legs, my spine, swollen and stinking, smelling more like Mother. So hungry. I ache with the hunger. I have to go into the wet for food. I don't have a choice, so I go. I catch the crunchy bugs. They don't fight back. Maybe they are all sleeping, but they are limp and floppy. I dive further and find out why. It doesn't matter what I do. Anything I do, the bright does not care. It has seeded again and overtaken the wet. It's bursting with the bright, and it's so much worse seeing it through the wet, split and bursting into my eyes. So bright I can still see it through all my closed eyelids. I can feel them in the wet around me. Their hurt, their hate. It burns more than I have ever felt, even more than my legs and my spine. I nearly don't make it out. The hurting bright makes my limbs go numb and my eyes sting and blur. But I crawl out of the wet, clicking and whimpering, dragging my useless legs behind me. I choke on the food as I eat it. Useless, useless, useless. Bad noises, bad bright. 2 legs, giant teeth, giant mouth. I can't bear it. Inside. Seal the membrane. Go to Mother. Bring her the food I have caught for her and leave some for my sisters. To Mother. My sisters. Just need to eat, to live. That is all. I never should have gone away from here. Never should have climbed up. Nearly there, Mother. Nearly. I am woken up again, and I know why. Before I even look, I know the bright is right outside. So much, so many, I can see it through the membrane. It's not fair. I don't have the strength to fight it now, not anymore. There is no point. Even before the rock fell on me, I couldn't fight back. Not really. The bright is growing. I can see it growing in front of me. I trace the vines and they go back down to the wet. The wet is just a tangle of bright and vines now. My barrier in the other tunnel is still there, still protecting. But I can hear the bad noises. The 2-leg things. They know where I am and they are coming. Why does everyone hate me? It isn't fair. I am trapped, both sides, walls, no walls, closing in, falling down. I just go back inside with Mother. With the bright outside the door, I can see her. And I can see my sisters too. They've come back. I must not disturb them. They are sleeping, healing, yes. Still thin, still gooey, but healing. They are still. Wait, a Mother isn't healing. Why isn't it working? The sleep? She is so thin, and the color. Her skin is covered in patches of bad color, and she hasn't eaten any of the food I brought her. I try to take care of her and clean her with my tongues, but the taste is awful. Pressure inside me comes back and pushes out of my feeder in a gush of fluid and chewed up bugs. 3rd story. My name is John Dawson. I'm a police lieutenant from Canton, Georgia. In my 20 years on the force, I have dealt with some pretty rough characters. My family and I live in a small suburban house just outside the city. Although I spend most of my time in the hustle and bustle of downtown Canton, I've always been an outdoorsman at heart. I think that's because of my father. Every year during the summer, I would take time off work to go camping and hunting in the woods with my father and my 2 sons, Robert and Richard. Robert, my oldest son, was a bit of a troublemaker. Every other day, I get a call from his school's principal saying that Robert had been picking fights with other students. In spite of his violent tendencies, Robert loved to go hunting with me and my father. I taught him from a young age how to handle a rifle, and after only a month of practice, he was as deadly as a Marine sniper. Richard, on the other hand, was the polar opposite. Don't get me wrong. Richard was a good kid and always got the best grades at school. But when it came to the outdoors, Richard was never too keen on camping. He mostly liked to read sci-fi comics and stay up watching B-movies on weekends. He especially didn't like the idea of killing other animals for food or sport. Despite this, I would still bring him along with his brother. While Robert and I would go off into the woods to hunt deer, Richard would sit around at the campsite listening to his grandpa lecture on about fighting in the Korean War. Richard always seemed to like Dad's war stories, even when he went into the occasional gruesome detail about blowing a North Korean's head off with his rifle. Dad had passed away about 4 years ago, ending our little yearly hunting trips. At the end of July, I decided to surprise my boys by doing something special before they had to go back to school. I had rented a weekend up at a campground in Blue Ridge. We were gonna have our first hunting trip in years. I fixed up the old family RV for the trip. The RV was spacious with a long walkway that ran down the full length of the motorhome. Behind the driver's seat was a small kitchen area with a sink, stove, oven, and refrigerator. A decent-sized dining booth sat opposite of the walkway just behind the passenger seat. On the other end of the side door was a small lounge area with a large window that allowed sunlight to pour through. Towards the rear of the motorhome was a small bedroom with a long pull-out bed and a bunk bed across from it with a moderately sized bathroom nearby. Robert was elated to hear the news. Richard was less than enthusiastic about going hunting. Then, I remembered there was going to be a meteor shower that weekend. Knowing Richard's love of space and sci-fi movies and the fact that we would have a good view of the shower from our campsite, I told Richard about the meteor shower. Immediately, his face lit up like a Christmas tree. The weekend soon arrived and we got up early Friday morning to finish packing. While Robert and Richard loaded up the camping gear, I prepared the guns for our hunting trip. I decided to bring my .308 Winchester rifle and my father's old single-barrel shotgun along with about 15 rounds of ammunition for each. We weren't planning on hunting too many deer that weekend, and since Robert and Richard hadn't practiced shooting in a while, I felt it best to go sparingly and save on ammunition. I also brought my Smith & Wesson Model 19 revolver as a backup along with an extra clip of ammunition. We got on the road at 8 in the morning and got to Union County within a couple hours. Union County was a large, unincorporated community close to Blue Ridge. Aside from a few shops and gas stations, there was nothing but forest and farmland as far as the eye could see. We stopped for gas around 10:15. While I was pumping the gas, I noticed a crusty-looking old man in ragged clothing standing next to the gas station store. He was ranting on about strange beings arriving from space using the meteor shower as a front for their arrival. Richard seemed pretty unnerved by the old man, so I quickly finished fueling up and got us back on the road. In hindsight, I probably should have listened what the man said. We got to our campsite around noon. We unpacked our supplies, loaded our guns, and began our trek deeper into the woods. I gave Robert the rifle while Richard held onto the shotgun. Both of my sons understood basic firearm safety, so, under my supervision, I had little to worry about any accidental fire. As we reached a small clearing, we spotted a 3-point buck in the distance. Robert aimed down the scope at his target, making sure to account for the wind. With an exhale, Robert slowly squeezed off a round. The round hit the deer in one of its front legs. The wounded creature began to stagger away. Fearing he'd miss his chance, Robert quickly racked the bolt to chamber a new round and fired it into the deer's head, finally dropping him. With the noise of the gunshots driving the other animals deeper into the forest, we decided to haul back our prize to the campsite. I told my two sons that this deer would be our dinner for the day and that Robert would need to clean it since it was his kill. I pulled out my hunting knife and showed Robert how to skin and gut the carcass. With a little time, Robert soon flayed the carcass like a professional butcher. Richard was understandably troubled by the sickening sight of his blood-stained brother butchering the deer. He turned away with a pale, anguished look on his face. Later that afternoon, I cooked us some venison burgers on the stove in the RV. We lounged in front of the RV and ate our dinner as the sun slowly set in the sky. Surprisingly, Richard enjoyed the burgers and, with the golden sky giving way to the star-spangled blackness of night, was in awe of the beauty in front of him. For the first time, it seemed like he really enjoyed coming with us on this trip. As sky grew darker, we could finally see the meteor shower. We were all taken back by the glistening balls of blue-tinted light raining down from the heavens above. As Robert and Richard continued taking in the starry spectacle, I couldn't help but think about Dad. He would have loved to have seen his two grandsons enjoying the outdoors together. After an hour, it was time for us to get ready for bed. We cleaned up our mess so as to not attract any animals foraging for food. We went to bed a little after 9. Richard slept above Robert in the bunk bed while I lay on the pull-out bed across from them. As I felt myself nearly falling asleep, I was jolted awake by a small explosion in the distance. Normally, with the sounds of nature, I wouldn't have noticed such a sound so far away. But as I sat up, I realized the forest was eerily silent around our motorhome. There were no crickets chirping in the grass or owls hooting in the trees above us. Richard and Robert were still asleep in their beds. The fatigue of the long drive meant that hardly anything could pull them from their slumber. I quickly crept out of bed to the side door. I grabbed the flashlight and shotgun, fearing it might have been a bear or some other large creature that made the racket. I slowly creaked the door opening and walked out in front of the motorhome. The forest was ominously dark as even the stars had receded in the void of blackness. I slowly looked around with my flashlight, the shotgun propped against my shoulder ready to fire. After about a minute of silence, I breathed a sigh of relief and turned to head back inside when I heard something unusual. A strange series of erratic clicking noises. It sounded otherworldly, like no animal I had heard before. As I turned toward the source, I realized the noise was coming from the back of the RV. I slowly crept along the wall of the motorhome and peeked around the corner. What I saw made my blood run ice cold. I tried to scream but was too paralyzed in fear to utter a sound. Standing in front of the small bedroom window was a tall, thin creature. Its long, lanky arms hung so low that its knuckles nearly touched the ground. Its skin was a pale gray color, like charcoal after it's burned all the way down. It had a large, elongated head, seemingly too big for its scrawny neck to support it. It lacked any lips as its yellow teeth locked in a permanent grit. Its most noticeable feature was its large, pupil-less eyes, even blacker the darkness pervading the forest. It leaned up and stared through the window with an unrelenting gaze. As I could feel my palms becoming clammy with sweat, my flashlight slipped out of my hands and hit the ground with a thud. The creature suddenly turned and was soon staring at me with the same unrelenting gaze as before. I stood frozen as the creature paused to stare at me. Then, it began to lumber towards me with its lanky legs. Immediately, I regained control of my nerves and fired the shotgun right at the creature, knocking him back against the ground. My ears were ringing from the gunshot as Robert and Richard ran out of the RV to find me standing over the fallen creature. Green blood oozed from the pellet holes in its abdomen. As we contemplated what kind of creature this was, we heard rustling from the bushes near our RV, followed by more erratic clicking sounds, now merging together into a cacophony of clicks and grunts. Immediately, we ran back inside our motorhome and locked the door. I unplugged the refrigerator and pushed it against the door. As we looked through the large window, we could see over a dozen of those things lumbering closer to our motorhome. Robert and Richard ducked behind the dining table as Robert grabbed the rifle and fired through the window. I leapt to the driver's seat to get the engine started when I heard a new sound. The sound of feet against something metallic. I soon realized that something was on the roof of the RV, drawing near to the large dormer window on top. As the window slid open, Richard grabbed the shotgun and fired up at the roof. I looked to the window next to my seat just in time to see one of the creatures falling off the roof with a loud thud. Richard had never shot anything before, but somehow, in the heat of the moment, his survival instincts kicked in as he joined Robert in holding off the besieging creatures as they continued advancing toward our motorhome. I continued to try and start the engine, but to my horror, the starter motor began to click, rapidly indicating that the battery was dead. There was no way to jumpstart the motor with those creatures still outside. As we grew lower on ammunition, the creatures swarmed from all sides and began to beat on the walls and windows furiously. It seemed that we were done for. Suddenly, I was blinded by a bright light pouring in from the windshield through the darkness. I soon realized it was an old pickup truck. The driver door swung open as a Molotov cocktail soared through the air, and landed in front of our side door, causing the creatures to recoil and shriek in fear of the roaring flames. Soon after, a familiar and crusty-looking face emerged from the truck. It was the old man from the gas station we saw earlier that day. Immediately, the old man popped the hood of his truck and grabbed a pair of jumper cables from the back. "Quickly," he shouted, "before the flames die down. It's the only thing they seem to fear." Immediately, I popped the hood of my RV and watched the man frantically attach the jumper cables to the batteries of both vehicles. Suddenly, I saw one of the creatures sneaking up behind the old man. I immediately drew my revolver and fired, downing the creature before it had a chance to strike. The man gave me a nod of gratitude before hopping back in his truck and revving his engine. I tried the key again and finally managed to start the engine on the RV. Just then, the flames from the Molotov cocktail died down as more of those creatures emerged, scowling with anger. The man climbed into the bed of his pickup and began firing at the creatures with an old lever-action rifle. We continued firing to stave off the horde, but soon ran out of ammunition. The man then motioned us to go on and leave him. I hesitated for a moment, not wanting to leave him behind, but with the creatures breaking through the windows, I reluctantly maneuvered past his truck and drove off, not caring that the jumper cables were still attached to our battery. Richard looked back one last time through the bedroom window as the man was tackled by the horrendous horde. I don't think I took my foot off the gas until we were back near our neighborhood. We got back home around midnight. Apart from our battered and dented RV, all of us survived uninjured. I doubt any of us slept the rest of that night. The following Monday, I returned to work at the station. Shortly afterwards, the captain handed me a missing persons report for Union County. When I read the file, I couldn't believe my eyes. The report was for the old man that saved our lives. I didn't tell the captain or anyone for that matter about what happened that weekend. No one would believe what we saw. Heck, I'm not even sure I believed it. Over the next week, I oversaw the investigation to try and find the man. As we combed every inch of the forest, we could find no trace of the man or his pickup truck. Only a trail of tire tracks in the dirt was found. Soon after, a convoy of unmarked black sedans drove onto the scene. A group of shady men dressed in black suits and brandishing badges emblazoned with the seal of Justice Department emerged from their vehicles and announced that they would take over the investigation. It seems strange considering that the captain never told us that the FBI was taking charge or that no other branch of law enforcement was notified of the investigation. Not even the State Patrol. But we all went along with it. I don't think the rest of my men even knew the true nature of what happened or how deep the iceberg was. Before leaving, I managed to find something at the edge of the forest clearing. It was a dented lever-action rifle stained with green blood. I decided to keep it as a memento. I'm not sure what drove me to keep a piece of evidence from the rest of the investigators. Maybe I thought it wouldn't have made much of a difference in aiding the investigation. Or perhaps I wanted to keep it to remember the unnamed man who gave his life to save my family. I still don't know what those things were or why they attacked us. I can only guess that they were in fact invaders from space. When I heard that initial explosion that night, it must have been one of the meteorites they had traveled on. The old man must have been trying to warn us back at the gas station through his seemingly insane rantings. I guess you really can't judge a book by its cover. I don't know what made him come to our aid, but I'm glad he did. We wouldn't be alive right now if it wasn't for him. I just hope no one else would come face to face with such horrid beings. Personally, I think I'm done with the great outdoors for a while. I said before that I had busted some pretty rough suspects during my career, but those creatures were unlike anything I ever faced before. And so I leave with this: if any of you decide to go into the woods for hunting or camping, stay safe and stay vigilant. For I can say that despite my experience enforcing the law, there is only one law that all living creatures live by in the wild. And that is the law of survival. Fourth story. Damn, I ain't never seen it turn so cold before, shouted Marshall over the howling winds of the snowstorm. Just keep going. As long as we keep moving, we'll make it to the cave by sundown, Jackson yelled as he glanced up from the map of the mountain range. He could barely read the map in front of him, let alone make out the entrance of the cave they were heading to. Daniel kept his eyes on the trail ahead of them, looking for any sign of cave they had marked on the map. The rumors of the cave in this area better have been true. The team had made a pilgrimage to the Yukon due to reports in the area of recently discovered gold. The cave they were heading to what was said to be an untouched vault of riches, just waiting to be mined. By this time next month, the trio would return to California as millionaires. The team rode for what seemed like hours against the harsh, bone-chilling winds of the blizzard before them, kept going only by the thoughts of the wealth they would amass. As the dim light offered by the sun obscured by the clouds in the sky got darker and darker, and sank below the horizon, the team finally was about to make out the outline of the mouth of a cave just out of the shadows on the edge of their lights. "There it is," yelled Jackson, as he pointed toward the entrance to the cave. "Finally!" cried Daniel. "Any longer, and I'd lose my damn fingers." The three prospectors gave it their all, and made one final push past the rampaging winds and snow to make it to the sanctuary offered by the cave. Upon entering the cave, Marshall, Daniel, and Jackson decided to set up camp and start mining for gold in the morning. Daniel started a fire while Jackson and Marshall unloaded their supplies from the wagon and placed all of their tools and equipment down next to the walls of the caves. As they were sitting by the fire, the team filled their cups with whiskey they had brought, a preemptive celebration for what was to come the next day. Marshall looked to his friends and said, "1 month, my friends. Only 1 month of work, and we'll head back to California as rich men." "Yeah," replied Jackson. 1 month, and we'll never have to work another day of our lives." The men drank half the bottle between themselves and decided to save the rest for long days of work to come. They would get more when they head back to town for supplies. In the morning, the team got to work on the mine, wanting to work quickly before word of the cave reached other prospectors. They worked tirelessly all day, craving out a decent-sized hole in the wall that could be used as a passage deeper into the mine. While mining out the wall, the two finally stumbled upon their first sign of gold, a single chunk of a nugget resting snugly in the wall. "Jackson! Daniel!" cried Marshall. "Get over here. I found some gold." "Really?" Daniel questioned excitedly as he and Jackson ran over to Marshall. The miners looked into the wall and saw the chunk of precious metal looking back at them. "Well shit, let's get it out of there then," Jackson said, as he raised his pickaxe and struck the wall to release the golden ore. At last, Jackson thought, their hard work was yielding rewards. 1 golden chunk for now, but so much more to come in the future. Just as Jackson finished his thought, the wall gave way, and the piece of rock holding the chunk of gold fell to the ground. Jackson bent over and excitedly looked down at the gold, the payoff to all these long months of travel to the Yukon. To his surprise, however, he noticed Marshall wasn't as interested as he was in the gold they had just unearthed. Instead, Marshall was now looking into the small hole in the wall that was now left by the dislodged rock that covered it, holding up his lantern to illuminate the darkness within. "Holy shit," Marshall said, dumbfounded, not breaking his gaze from the small hole, as it was all he could do to say that. "What is it?" asked Jackson, as he walked over to the hole his friend was staring through, as if he could see the gates of heaven through it. Marshall stepped to the side so his friend could take a look, still unable to speak from what he saw inside. Jackson lifted his own lantern to see what was inside, and once he was able to see through it, he was just as shocked as Marshall. Through the hole was revealed to be a deep hallway, studded with many more veins of golden ore. He started for what felt like forever, until a sudden gust of strong wind came from the small hole and extinguished the fire within his lantern. "Damn it!" yelled Jackson as he struck a match to relight his lantern. As the light came back, he looked into the hole again, only to reveal a bloodshot eye looking back into his. "Jesus Christ!" Jackson screamed as he fell back onto the ground and hurriedly lifted the lantern back into the hole to get a better look at whatever was in there, only to find the eye was now gone. "What happened?" Daniel asked as he helped lift his friend off the ground and onto his feet. "I think there's an animal or something in there," Jackson replied as he tried to catch his breath. "Looked pretty big from the size of the eye that was looking back at me. All right, we'll get to work on this wall here. Hopefully there's even more down that passage," Marshall said, as he grabbed his pickaxe and placed his pistol in his holster just in case the animals down there were dangerous. Daniel and Jackson both picked up their own pickaxes as well, eager to get to work on the gold, and mine all of the gold the three of them could carry. With the three of them working together, the wall would be brought down, and the gold would be mined in no time. Finally, the tunnel they were heading down opened up into a wide room with a drop-off leading to a dark chasm, barely illuminated by the increasing dimming light in the oil lantern. Just out from the darkness came the source of the noise the men had heard earlier, a giant man, approximately 15 feet in height, clad in robe with motifs whose origins were unknown to them, bloodshot eyes that appeared to stare directly into the soul. The giant outstretched his hands. His fingers were missing parts of the skin, bone visible on some parts on his fingers and on his palms. He spoke in a deep, booming tone of voice, simply saying, "Welcome, new residents," revealing his teeth, many broken, but those that remained had a shark-like appearance, sharp enough to bite through flesh. "What the fuck is that?" Marshall screamed, drawing his pistol from its holster and firing at the giant. The pistol proved ineffective. The bullets did nothing to the creature before them. If his skin was too thick to be pierced, or if he simply did not care about the injuries he had just received, they did not know. Once it was realized that the bullets had done nothing, the three men turned around and ran as fast as they could, not daring to look behind them, out of fear that the monster was right behind them. Their fears became reality as the creature caught up with them, fast, and grabbed Marshall by the bags of treasure that hung over his back. Jackson and Daniel still running as they heard the sound of more gunfire mixed with the sounds of the final screams emitted by Marshall. The two ran forward, determined to not share the fate of their fallen friend, who failed to escape from the giant that occupied the catacombs. Once in what they believed to be a safe distance, the two remaining men dropped to the ground to catch their breath and weep over the loss of their companion. "What the fuck was that thing?" Daniel asked in between sobs and labored breathing. I don't know," Jackson replied through his own tears. "Oh God, Marshall, I'm so sorry. We have to go back," Daniel said. "We can't leave without something of his at least. Something to remember him by." "You're right," Jackson agreed as he finally caught his breath. "I think that thing was what I saw when we got the first piece of gold out. If it was up there with us, there has to be a way back to the entrance we made to get in." "Okay," Daniel said, now rising to his feet. "We should grab his gun too. Maybe if we shoot that thing in the eyes or something we can kill it, or blind it so we can run away." Daniel offered his outstretched hand to Jackson to help him up. Jackson accepted and let his friend pull him to his feet. This plan had to work. They had to make it out for Marshall. The two men quietly made their way back to the chamber they lost their friend in, constantly looking over their shoulders and listening for the faintest noises that could indicate the monster being anywhere nearby. The path was lit only by the soft glow of the dying oil lantern they had brought with them, both now slightly grateful for the fact that the light was much less noticeable than before. Jackson covered the light in front of him with his coat, attempting to hide the light pouring out of it to the best of his ability while still making the path before them visible. They had probably only run a few hundred yards away from the room they had encountered the giant in, but now it felt like they had been walking for miles, all the while slowly inching towards certain death. At last, the passage opened up again, and the duo snuck their way into the room they had fled from earlier. Upon entering the room, the light they were holding slowly revealed to them the half-eaten remains of Marshall. The monster had bitten off his right arm and tore out a large majority of his throat and his upper chest. The two of them looked away in horror, now seeing the mangled remains of their friend, torn to shreds by the abomination that was now hunting them. Jackson slowly walked over to Marshall's body, attempting to take his necklace as a memento from his corpse, and reached the gun that was still in his hand. When Jackson and Daniel made it to the carcass that belonged to their comrade, they saw that Marshall was still alive, bleeding out and slowly choking to death on his own blood. Once they crouched down to closer to him, Marshall finally recognized them, reaching out his arm to hand them the gun that had failed to save his life. Please." Marshall choked out from the blood pouring out from his throat. Lisa said, "Shoot me." Jackson took the gun from his friend and considered their options. If he took the shot, he could very well alert the giant that they were still there, and they could be killed next. However, Marshall was his best friend, and it tore him up inside to see him suffer like that. All it would take would be a single shot through the head to put him out of his misery. Jackson knew Marshall wasn't long for his world. He was losing so much blood on top of the blood. He must have already lost when the behemoth had grabbed him, and would probably die soon anyways. But that didn't change anything. If shooting Marshall would bring him peace even a second sooner, Jackson would deal with the consequences of that for his friend. With that, Jackson shakily lifted the pistol and gave his friend a teary goodbye before putting him out of his misery. For a moment, Jackson simply stood there in silence. So much raced through his mind as he was stuck by the crashing waves of grief, sorrow, and remorse for bringing his friends down into these mines. In the back of his mind, he had at least hoped that if they were all to die down here, then at least they would die together. But Marshall had died slowly, in pain and all alone. Tears streamed down Jackson's face, and he was suddenly snapped back into reality by Daniel grabbing his shoulder and pushing him down to the ground. He hid the lantern with the side of his jacket and slowly led his friend into a corner of the room behind a large boulder. The giant had already entered the room. Daniel held his finger up to his lips in a silent request for his friend to stay silent. Perhaps the two of them could still slip away if they stayed quiet, moved slowly, and kept out of the monster's sight. Just as Daniel had finished this thought, the boulder the two were hiding behind was lifted by the giant and thrown with a great force across the room. Daniel screamed as the monster had taken hold of him. His screaming intensified as it started to crush his bones in his arms and legs with its overwhelming strength. Jackson could only watch in horror as the giant had taken another one of his friends in front of him. Watching Daniel scream in agony as his body was crushed, and he was crumpled like a paper ball. Jackson was now the last man standing. Jackson watched in horror as another one of his friends had been killed in front of him. His only option was to run to the passage the two had hoped would be an escape, and offer salvation from the terrors of the catacombs. Jackson looked behind him as he ran towards the opening, realizing the giant was now nowhere to be seen. Fifth story. My friends and I have always been pranksters. Our four-man group is comprised of Ricky, Danny, Taika, and myself. This story is about the consequences of our actions. Occasionally, we tend to go a little too far. A prank is a form of affection in our eyes. We never hold a grudge or do anything out of malice. At least that's what I thought. Ricky suggested that we kick our senior year off with something that had a chance to go viral on Halloween. Naturally, the rest of us didn't need much convincing. All we needed was an idea. Now, we all have our preferences, so that wasn't going to be an easy task. Me, I'm all about the laughs. Probably because when I was little, I'd get called a clown because of my bright red hair, though I eventually embraced it. I thought it'd be hilarious to buy a bunch of blow-up dolls and place them selectively throughout our school. The reactions from teachers, students, and whoever else saw them would be gold. Plus, who knows how long it'd be before they were all found. Even now, thinking about it cracks a smile on my face. Danny likes freaking people out. He has that edgelord vibe to him, which is exactly what he looks like. He wanted to fill the bathrooms with pests, and then make a ruckus and scare the living shit out of people. It would have been funny, but that doesn't seem like something the school would look the other way on. I'm not looking to pay the janitorial fees for that either. Taika likes to confuse people. He does the most random stuff. You'd never expect the tall, innocent-looking kid to be as bizarre as he is. One time he tricked a gym class into removing their shoes, only to hide all the left ones. Another time he wore a different costume to school every day for a month. In April, he never told anyone why. That's the kind of guy he is. Lastly, there is Ricky, the ringleader of our little group. His style is unpredictable. He gives off smaller, more sadistic Logan Paul vibes. I've seen him write 150 love letters, one for every girl in our grade, and give out one per day for nearly the entire year just to make them smile. I've also seen him hotwire a car, steal it, and then hop out and crash it because it was blocking his driveway. He carried a flask in his jacket for the majority of the last year and a half at school, for crying out loud. The guy is fucking crazy, but I'll be damned if I don't love him. We all appreciate each other's styles, but something this big couldn't be a collaborative idea. So we did what any rational group of high school males would do. We let a homeless guy outside the liquor store choose. Who do you think he sided with? Guys, you're gonna love it. We are gonna freak the fuck out of people. Someone might literally shit their pants. Then we can post all the best reactions online. Well, that's all I needed to hear. I knew Danny would be in too. I looked over at Taika, who nodded in approval. Ricky explained the gist of it to us. He had found a group online called Scarelair. They set up the craziest haunted houses you could imagine. They only accepted online requests for them to come to your town. If you made a compelling enough case and sent in a deposit, they would come to town and deliver the scariest experience possible. They would do the setup and everything, and they guaranteed that whoever participated would have their lives changed forever. It was literally their tagline. No one comes out the same. Instead of a regular haunted house, we were going to turn it into a game with a prize, a la Mr. Beast, and prank the living hell out of a few people. We scrounged together a few $1,000s between the 5 of us and submitted our request. Days went by without a response. Together and waited. Ricky's phone started vibrating. Oddly enough, it said he was receiving a call from me. Obviously a glitch because I was staring right at my cell, and I clearly wasn't calling him. He answered and put it on speaker. "Hey guys, this is Matt from Scarelair. It sounded like you wanted to make some changes to the usual stuff we do. What did you have in mind?" he asked. Taika leaned over to me and said, "Dude looks kinda sketch, so we were thinking of turning it into a game with a prize. Haunted houses are cool and all, but if you're not into that stuff, you're not going to be talked into it, right? If we made it a game with a cash prize, then more people could be persuaded. Know what I mean?" "Yeah, I hear you. Did you have certain people in mind? How many people were you thinking?" We all looked at each other. "Well," asked Danny, "I'm thinking 5 people. One of us would take a spot to kind of help steer things along." Ricky added, "I don't think you need to worry about it, but hey, if that's what you want, that's fine. Should we include your friend in the game, or mostly let him be?" "Let him be." Just to be safe, I blurted out. If it ended up being me, I didn't want to be the one soiling his pants and then having that go viral. "Sounds good. We'll have everything set up by Saturday. We'll do some social media marketing to get some buzz. If you have particular people you want in it, text me the details," Matt said. "Anything else?" "So how do you guys make money?" Danny asked. "Don't get me wrong, we're over the moon you're doing this for us, but $3,000 can't go that far toward equipment. We live stream all of our events and get tons of donations. To help with your game idea, we'll actually put $1,000 of what you gave us as a cash prize. Anything else?" I looked at Taika and shrugged. Danny looked to Ricky. "You guys are the experts, right? We'll let you take care of the rest," he said. "Perfect." Matt said he'd text us the rest of the details the next day. Just like that, we were in business. We decided that Danny would be the one to join the random people in the game. His antics would make for the most epic inclusion. Ricky told us he submitted a big list of potential people to include. He put out flyers that advertised winning $1,000 by surviving the scariest haunted house of all time. By Wednesday, the remaining 4 players had been decided and had accepted their invitations. Those 4 were Allison Beckham, a girl Ricky once had a fling with. Picture Anna Kendrick if she wasn't witty. Kyle Conklin, Allison's current boyfriend, and someone you'd expect to be extremely successful someday. Anders Lucas, the quiet, nerdy type with messy dark hair. Finally, Tana Schultz, who would be best described as a B-list popular girl, and not because of her personality. As soon as I saw Allison and Kyle were in, I knew they were going to have a bad time. Ricky would make sure of that. We met with Matt on Thursday to check out the venue and finalize everything. We drove up in my dad's truck and arrived at a massive warehouse. Matt and a few others walked out to greet us. He looked kinder in person. I peered over at Taika, and I could tell he felt the same. "Hey guys, come on in and check everything out. We want to know what you think," Matt said. We all walked in, and upon seeing the layout, we all let out an audible gasp. I don't know what exactly we were expecting, but it wasn't this. These guys were absolute professionals, and the place looked amazing. From floor to ceiling, the place was decked out to look like the creepiest graveyard of all time. Headstones casting long shadows, empty graves, demonic symbols flickered in eerie candlelight. Even the grass appeared unsettling. Matt led us to the right and unlocked some doors. Then we followed him up a staircase. He opened another door at the top. There were monitors everywhere showing dozens of different angles of the layout. Anything that happened down there we'd be able to see from here. So a couple things Matt started. We go all out. Do not go downstairs while the game is ongoing. It's not safe. Stay here where you can watch and enjoy together. We'll record everything on our servers and send you the files after about a week. Danny, you'll want to wear a green shirt to let our guys know you're in the clear. Make sure you tell each of our other guests playing not to wear green. Everyone will drop their phones in the box at the entrance, so nothing disturbs the experience. We'll have a tech guy standing by. If you need him, just hit the yellow key over here. If you have any non-tech issues, you'll want to hit the red key. That'll start up a live chat with Jimmy. These events can get intense, and Jimmy deals with these all the time. So he'll be able to help you out with anything you need. He'll be on site in another room. We thanked him for his help and went our separate ways. Now all we had to do was wait. Ricky received a text the next day saying preparations were complete, and that on Saturday we should arrive an hour early. That way we could get in and away from everything before anyone arrived. He also sent out the dress code instructions to everyone playing. The next few days were agonizingly slow. All we could think about was Saturday. Finally, the day arrived. As requested, we showed up early and got ourselves situated. We all wore black, hanging by the entrance, except Danny, who was wearing orange. Weren't you supposed to wear green? Taika asked. Oh come on, Taika, live a little. Of anyone here, I'm the most likely to be into this kind of stuff. Besides, green doesn't really fit the Halloween spirit. I'm not sure that's a great idea, I started. Bro, it's fine. I have a green hat in my bag just in case. Taika shrugged. Ricky rolled his eyes. We made our way up the stairs and stepped into the control room. This is going to be so sick, Ricky said, pulling out his flask and taking a sip of vodka. We couldn't wait to see what was going to go down. Minutes flew by, and one by one, the targets had arrived. Well, boys, I'll see you on the other side, Danny said. He grabbed a walkie, left the control room, and headed downstairs. Best of luck, bitch, Ricky yelled after him, laughing. One by one, the players arrived. They were ushered into a small room. Danny entered the room last. He snuck up behind Tana and tapped her, forcing her to jump up and let out a squeal. She flipped around and scowled. Oh great, you're with us, she said sarcastically. Nice to see you too, Tana, Danny replied. I see you were able to follow the dress code. He motioned towards her maid costume. Like I'd be caught dead wearing green in public, she responded, disgusted. She took a step closer to Allison and Kyle, who were dressed up as Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce. Allison shifted her body awkwardly towards Kyle. Hey Danny, she said. Allison, Danny replied. Kyle noticed Allison's uncomfortable expression and placed his arm around her. Danny frowned. Wait, like who the fuck is that? Tana asked, looking at the quiet boy in the oversized black t-shirt and sweatpants in the corner. I'm Anders. Tana's confused expression didn't change. Tana, we've all been in class together since grade school. Come on, Kyle said. I didn't know, she said, waving her arms. Allison gave her a disapproving scowl. Anders looked down and started rubbing his right arm. Well, I like your costume, he said quietly. Yeah, thanks, she responded coldly. Suddenly the lights turned off, plunging the room into complete darkness. The two girls screamed. The game has begun. Dim, blood-red lighting cast an eerie glow, allowing the players to regain some of their vision, and a thick fog encompassed the area. The gate slowly creaked open. Everyone exchanged nervous glances and then walked to the graveyard that lay ahead. Before them loomed 3 massive graves. The headstones, from left to right, read the unknown, demonic, and slasher. Welcome, players. Please choose a path. Hey, so how do we win the $1,000? Allison asked. Survive, the automated voice retaliated. Spooky, Kyle laughed. We watched as Allison, Kyle, and Tana walked to the middle grave. Anders and Danny both walked to the right. The ground seemingly came alive as deformed hands sprouted from the earth beneath them. The group all jumped. Jesus Christ, Tana cried out, her voice trembling. I'm sorry, that response is invalid. Each grave must be occupied. More hands started to pop up out of the ground. Their grotesque fingers brushed against the players' ankles. Low, whooshing sounds began to play in the background. Can we make a decision, please? Allison urged. These things are so creepy. We signaled Danny that he should take the left door. Fine, I'll take the left, he said. Great, we're all settled. Let's go, Tana said, trying to sound brave. No, we're not. Tana, go with Anders. We can't make him go alone. Danny loves this stuff, so he'll be fine. But Anders looks uncomfortable already, Allison said. Forget that. You two just want to dump me off on him so you can find a place to have fun. She looked over at Anders. No offense. Sure, he replied. He twitched as another hand grazed his foot. Fine, I'll do it, Kyle said. I got you, buddy. Let's do this. Kyle extended his fist out to Anders. Anders studied him for a second before he reached out and bumped it with his own. Yay, Allison said, rolling her eyes. Thanks, Tana. With that, each group climbed down into their grave. A tunnel was beneath each of them, and they all headed forward. Danny entered the unknown, Allison and Tana entered demonic, and Kyle and Anders entered slasher. The tunnels were surprisingly long, and each one was unique. The unknown was a pitch-black abyss except for Danny's neon orange shirt. Inside demonic was a cave, and the further it went along, the tighter it became. A rhythmic noise could be heard faintly. Allison and Tana eventually had to crawl forward to be able to go ahead. I'm getting serious claustrophobia here, Tana said. Crawling through the rigid cave was scratching up her knees and elbows. You could have been with Anders right now if you hadn't been so rude to him earlier, Allison scoffed. The rhythmic sound was getting louder. I know. That's how I am. But I'm nice when it matters. Look, I'll apologize to him when we meet back up. Promise. The slasher tunnel was full of dirt that Kyle and Anders had to crawl through. Kyle's white jersey had quickly been stained brown. Good thing I didn't get the authentic jersey. Huh. Anders? Kyle laughed. Anders smiled. You can't even tell with what I'm wearing, he replied. The smartest one of us all, I see. Teach me your ways, Sensei, Kyle responded. Hey, I think I see where this tunnel opens up. Danny, do you copy? Ricky said. We peered at his monitor and saw the silhouette of him raise the walkie. He held it close to his shirt so we could see and motioned that he couldn't hear what we were saying. How about now? He shrugged and shook his head. What a bummer. I was looking forward to the random stuff he was gonna do, Taika said. You're the random one, Taika. But not getting to see what messed up ideas Danny had is going to make this less fun. Oh, we'll still have plenty, Ricky replied, grinning. I can't believe how lucky we are that we got your ex, her current boy toy, and a brat like Tana all in one group, I said. I wouldn't exactly call it luck, Ricky smirked. What do you mean? Taika asked. Well, if you're going to scare the shit out of people as a prank, you might as well choose who, right? And if you're going to choose, why not make it people you want to see embarrassed? Didn't you give Matt a big list? Nope, just these 4. Why? I asked. Because I fucking hate them. Duh. I stood there for a moment, puzzled. I get Allison and Kyle. But the others? Come on. Tana's the biggest bitch in school. We all know if she wasn't hot no one would put up with her shit, Ricky replied. Had put a damper on the mood, but at this point, I still wanted to have fun. Hey, where did Danny go? Taika asked. Ricky and I looked at his monitor, and it was pitch black. We can't see or hear him. So much for him guiding things, I whined. No, it's fine, look. We saw Kyle and Anders crawl their way up through another hole above them to exit the tunnel. This led them to what looked like a floor of an abandoned hospital. On a separate monitor, 2 workers were making their way towards them. One looked like he was wearing something inspired by Leatherface, and the other wore a mask that was completely blank. They were closing in. Here we go, boys. Kyle and Anders were aimlessly walking down their corridor. Leaky faucets and old monitors could be heard in some of the abandoned patients' rooms. They really went all out with this, Kyle said as he passed by a shredded curtain. Yeah, Anders replied. He turned the corner and jumped back. There was a corpse wearing a hospital gown. Kyle ran his fingers over the body, his curiosity getting the best of him. That feels crazy real. Then he pinched his nose. Smells that way too. Holy shit, that's gross. Anders nodded, his eyes scanning the surroundings. I don't like it. They navigated through the hallway. Shadows danced and flickered along the walls, projecting ominous shapes that seemed to taunt them. Each sound, innocuous or not, sent a jolt of adrenaline through their bodies, heightening their senses. Something isn't right, Anders confessed, his voice laced with apprehension. We shouldn't have signed up for this. Kyle gave him a reassuring smile. We knew it would be scary, but remember why we're here. The challenge, the adrenaline, it's all part of the experience. Anders nodded, though his unease persisted. They continued down the corridor, their steps cautious and measured. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps rang down the hall. The hairs on the back of their necks stood on end as they turned to face the source. Emerging from the darkness were two figures. One, wearing a leather mask, took a bow. The other donned a completely blank mask. The masked men moved with purpose, closing the distance to Kyle and Anders. This is getting intense, Kyle muttered. His heart raced. He exchanged a quick glance with Anders. The blank masked man was steadily advancing towards them. Anders glanced at Kyle, his eyes wide with fear. We need to do something, Kyle. We can't just stand here. Our entrance did say slasher. So let's run. Without hesitation, he grabbed Anders' arm and pulled him around the nearest corner. They sprinted through the narrow corridor, their hearts pounding in their chests. Kyle glanced back and saw both of the masked men had increased their pace and were now sprinting towards them. They're coming, he yelled out. The sound of footsteps behind them followed, growing louder and closer. They could feel the presence of the leather masked man trailing just a few steps behind. The path twisted and turned, seeming to extend endlessly, but they pressed on. Finally, they dipped into an empty room. Gasping for breath, they slowly peeked outside the room, expecting the masked men to be right behind them. That was actually pretty fun, Anders said, breathing heavily. It was, wasn't it? Kyle replied, scanning their surroundings warily. But let's stay alert. They could be anywhere. With that, a door disguised as a wall shifted, and the blank masked man entered the room. Kyle and Anders picked themselves up, ready to exit, only to see the leather masked man before them with a machete. All right, you guys caught us. Kyle laughed. I guess you win. What happens now? That blade looks real, Anders whispered. Don't be silly. They'd never let them use real weapons. Before he could finish, the man in the leather mask plunged the blade deep into Kyle's abdomen. He released a guttural wail, reflexively stumbling back, hands clutching his wound. Anders' body was still as stone. It was as if he was completely mesmerized by what he was seeing. The masked man lunged with the blade once again. Kyle looked at Anders, pale in the face, gazing into his hypnotized eyes, and motioned toward the exit. Anders snapped back to reality, immediately taking off as the other masked man gave chase. My gaze shifted back to Tana and Allison, their situation becoming more dire by the second. The demon, now mere feet away, raised the cross, and the hooded figures all turned their attention toward him. With one quick swipe, Allison's flesh was deeply lacerated. She let out a feral cry as blood shot from her body. The demon lifted the cross again. He swung down once more, only for Tana to pull her down. Tana took the full brunt of the blow to her back. Tears streamed down her face, and the gash quickly stained the back of her costume with a dark red hue. Tana? Allison's voice quivered. Tana struggled to force a feeble smile. What kind of person would I be if I let you die? Relentlessly, he continued to hack away at Tana's back, and she persisted in protecting Allison. After yet another savage strike, her legs gave way, and her body crumpled to the floor. Tana, Allison cried out. The demon raised his cross high, going for the final blow. Then, a familiar voice filled the room. Hey, fuckers! Ricky and Taika stormed into the frame and tackled two of the hooded figures. Ricky quickly sprang to his feet and lunged at the man in the demon mask. He evaded a wild swing of the cross and took the man off his feet. Taika grabbed the two girls and helped them up. Tana's bloodied figure staggered, her movements feeble and unsteady. "What are you? You know what? I don't even care. Just get us out of here," she said. "Ricky?" Allison stammered as she eyed him squaring off with her assailant. My eyes darted frantically between the labyrinth of monitors, tracking the chaos with growing dread. In the midst of this bedlam, a sudden blur caught my attention, a lifeline amidst the mayhem. Anders. He had somehow eluded the clutches of the slashers and was crawling back through the dirt, clawing his way back to the graveyard. My gaze flickered across the control panel, seeking anything that could aid my friends. Anders had reached the grave, clambering out with the tenacity of a wounded animal. I had to act. And then, my frantic eyes fell upon a button, inconspicuous yet promising. "Anders!" I roared, my voice a frantic plea, transmitted over the intercom system. He froze, his eyes darting around the room, seeking the source of my voice. "They need your help in Demonic. The girls are under attack, just like Kyle." Anders hesitated, torn between the headstone that read Demonic and the promise of escape beyond the exit. His internal struggle played out before my eyes. He glanced toward the exit, his breath a labored rasp, then pivoted back to the gaping grave. Then he sprinted out of the building. I threw my hands up in frustration. I was angry but also in no position to judge. I swore beneath my breath, cursing the screens in front of me when a sudden, thunderous thud shattered the silence. Their breaths came in ragged gasps as they fled through the dimly lit cavern. It didn't take long for the two men to sprint after the girls. "We gotta go. How are we going to stop them from coming for us? We have to crawl through that tunnel to get away." "The fire," Allison croaked, her trembling finger pointing towards the hole from earlier. Ricky yanked a torch from the wall and held it out in front of the gaping void. A few moments later, an inferno burst forth from the hole, devouring the cross in its ravenous embrace and bathing the cavern in a flickering light. He cried out in pain as he couldn't avoid burning himself in the process. Taika and Tana, their faces replicating Ricky's frantic actions, brandished their own torches to conjure the flames. The sound of footsteps reverberated from further down the cave, drawing nearer with each passing second. Ricky, eyes wide with desperation, seized his flask and emptied it onto the cold, unforgiving ground. He tossed the cross atop the pool of spilled liquid and directed the others to do the same. The hooded figures were now within sight. As the encroaching horrors drew ever closer, a colossal wall of fire erupted into being, a barrier forged between them. The immense flames roared and crackled, splitting the cave into two distinct realms. One bathed in the hellish glow of the inferno, and the other shrouded in inky blackness, concealing their tormentors in a veil of darkness. The four of them backed away from the fire. "Allison, I'm so sorry," Ricky gasped. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her soft cheek. "It's not your fault," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She mustered a weak smile. That smile quickly dissolved into a cold, gnawing look of fear as the hooded figures materialized through the wall of flames. The searing heat devoured many of their bodies, causing them to crumble and vanish within the inferno. But two of them emerged relatively unscathed. With ghostly hands, they reached for Allison's ankles, their fingers scalding to the touch, and dragged her back through the raging fire. Ricky's gaze was locked upon the spectacle before him. Her screams were swallowed by the roar of the inferno, leaving behind a haunting silence. "Allison!" In an instant, Ricky went after her, charging headfirst into the searing flames. Taika and Tana sat back, unable to speak. Each passing moment felt like an eternity as they waited for their friends to return. The longer they waited, the more realization began to set in. "Tana, we need to go," Taika said softly. She nodded slowly. He threw her arm over his shoulder, and they stumbled back toward the entrance to the cave. My predicament was only getting worse. As I hid under a desk, the door continued to give way, and the barricade wasn't going to hold out much longer. As if on cue, the door shattered, and an arm appeared through the hole. I held my breath. My eyes darted back and forth between the killer and the only monitor I was able to view from where I hid. Taika and Tana had made it back to the graveyard. Taika exited first and reached down to pull Tana out. When Tana grabbed onto his outstretched arm, he tumbled back on top of her. She toppled backwards and winced as her bloody back contacted the hard, unforgiving surface below. She gasped for air as she struggled to move his unconscious body off of her. As she swung her arms around, she brushed against a cold, hard object protruding from the back of his skull. Her fingers closed around it. It was a knife. Standing outside the grave, just beyond the edge, was the man in the leather mask, peering down at her. She desperately increased her efforts to free herself. She squirmed and writhed to no avail. The masked man simply stood there watching. He tapped his wrist with his pointer finger and then shrugged. "Oh, fuck you," she spat. Finally, she managed to wriggle free from Taika's lifeless body. Then she grabbed the knee that had been embedded in Taika's skull. The masked man mockingly clapped and then backed off a few steps from the pit. "I don't even care anymore," she swore as she climbed free from the grave. The man beckoned for her to get closer and she lunged forward with the knife. He casually swatted her arm out of the way with one arm and began choking her with the other. Her cheeks reddened as oxygen was forced from her lungs. A voice echoed behind them and alerted both Tana and her pursuer. "Hey!" yelled Anders. The man in the leather mask turned his head to see the boy standing alone. With every ounce of energy she had left, Tana swiped towards the man with the blade. He dodged. The edge of the blade grazed his neck. He released Tana from his grasp and quickly examined the wound. Tana collapsed to the ground, the blade falling a few feet from her. "This is for Kyle," Anders roared, charging forward. The two figures wrestled in a violent struggle, their bodies crashing against the cold, unforgiving ground. Tana's heart pounded in her ears as she watched. Anders reached out for the knife, but his grasp was met with resistance. The masked man launched his fist into Anders' face, then crawled over him to grab the stray blade. The man slashed it across Anders' chest. A loud wail followed. He plunged the knife downwards. Anders' only reaction was to block with his right hand, which the blade seamlessly pierced through. The force of the stab brought Anders' hand down near his chest, penetrating his upper chest. He screamed in agony. The masked man gathered himself and stood on his feet, gazing at the victim below. Anders struggled but managed to dislodge the blade from his chest, though it was still firmly impaled through his hand. He weakly turned his hand over, blade pointing up, as he examined his chest wound. The leather-masked man lingered over him, seemingly enjoying the work he'd done to the frantic boy. One leg in front of the other, he bent down slightly to wag his finger. Anders kicked the man's front leg, which slid backward into the other, and he lost his balance. He fell forward and tried to catch himself, planting his hands into the ground. Anders flinched and turned his head away. The masked man's body tensed. The knife had gone directly through his eye into his skull. His arms lost function, causing his body to push down further, forcing the blade deeper into his brain. It didn't seem to register to Anders what had happened. He lay there in a trance, not even attempting to escape from the lifeless body covering him. Muffled shouts came from a few feet away but weren't enough to shake his beaming eyes from the corpse he had created. "Anders!" Tana screamed again. She had crawled over to him and was using what little energy she had left to set him free. His eyes didn't waver. "Anders!" Her hoarse voice roared again. This time it seemed to register, and he turned to face her. He managed to free himself and slowly brought himself to his feet. Tana tried to do the same but stumbled back to her knees. "Looks like your costume is ruined," Anders said, reaching out his arm. "Leave." "I thought about it, but something inside me compelled me to come back." "You couldn't have figured out your shit a little faster?" she whined. "We were attacked too, you know. Kyle's dead. Those cops better hurry the hell up. We aren't done." "What do you mean?" Anders asked. She pointed. Leaning by the exit was the man in the blank mask. "How long do you think you can hole yourself off in there?" came a voice from the other side of the barricaded door. "As long as I need," I replied. I peeked over the desk to the hole in the door. I saw eyes through the remains of Danny's face looking back at me. I quickly moved behind another desk outside of his line of sight. Monitors displayed what was going on downstairs. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted. "We don't deserve this. I don't deserve this." The man laughed. "You self-serving piece of shit. You and your friends set this entire thing up so you could go viral off the misery of others. You didn't bat an eye at putting these people's most vulnerable moments out there for millions to see, all for your own selfish entertainment. Well, guess what? We're doing the same thing. We're just better at it." Anders seemed to have a renewed sense of energy upon seeing the foe standing between them and the exit. He yanked the knife out of his hand and headed straight for Blank Mask. Dim red lights flickered as the two men prepared to end this. The two men swung at each other with ferocity. It appeared to be a race to land a decisive first blow. It was Blank Mask who struck first, his knife finding its mark deep inside Anders' shoulder. Pain shot through him like a bolt of lightning, yet his face remained as expressionless as the mask of his foe. He took a step back and yanked the blade out of his shoulder. He continued to struggle with his opponent, looking for openings to land a finishing blow. With a knife in each hand, Anders brought the full force of the blades into the man's skull, one from each direction. He unleashed a frenzied assault, the masked man's body convulsing as a result. Blood sprayed in all directions, painting the surroundings in a thick red coating. Tana, paralyzed with fear, could only watch as her companion tore his foe apart. With every slash, Anders became increasingly drenched in the masked man's insides. The masked man's body had long ceased any semblance of movement. Anders, soaked from head to toe in crimson liquid, looked up and closed his eyes, taking slow, deep breaths. Tana began to sob. He climbed off the masked man's body and made his way over to Tana. "Let's get out of here," Tana whimpered. Her sobbing quickly ceased, and her eyes grew wide. She looked down at the blade protruding out of her chest. Slowly, her gaze met that of her assailant. Anders simply smiled in return. "Why?" she gasped. Her eyes didn't leave his as her body collapsed, her legs no longer able to support her weight. Anders' pupils grew, and he bent down, leaning close to her face. Then he replied, "I never would have guessed it myself, Tana. In this place, we were forced to do some terrible things. Unforgivable things. As it turns out, now that I've tried those things, it seems I have a taste for them. It sounds ridiculous, but I'm thankful for this. If this hadn't happened, I probably would have lived out my life without ever experiencing a fraction of the pleasure I do now. For the first time in my life, I truly feel alive. Oh, and as for why? Well, of everyone here, you were the only one who treated me poorly. Do you think I would have done the same thing to them? You didn't even apologize. Besides, you said I could do whatever I wanted with you. The door is going to break down any moment now. I hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance, but I know they won't make it in time. I'm not sure what's worse, knowing I'm about to face the monster breaking down the door or playing a part in creating the monster downstairs. My friends and I played a stupid game, and now we're left with a stupid prize. They were right. No one comes out of Scare Lair the same. In other countries, totalitarian regimes take the opportunity to donate victims to the Astri as a form of tribute, sending them prisoners, political dissidents, and so-called undesirables as they cynically use the opportunity to kill two birds with one stone. This has been the state of affairs for too long, as the world leaders have sought to justify their secret collusion with the Astri mass murderers, believing that the sacrifice of countless thousands is necessary for the greater good, and because they fear the consequences of denying the alien slavers, knowing all too well that the Astri could devastate the Earth's surface with their space-based weaponry. But things have changed in recent times, which is why they sent me on this dangerous yet crucial diplomatic mission. For the first time in our history, we had a trump card to use against the Astri, and the powers that be back on Earth decided to play it. And so, I potentially had the future of humanity on my shoulders. That's a lot of pressure. But, as I sat in that holding area, I only hoped that the Astri wouldn't renege on their promise to allow us an audience, and would instead simply throw the two of us out of the airlock, leaving us to die in the cold vacuum of space. I almost jumped out of my skin when I heard the hidden speakers burst to life and a mechanical voice spoke to us in near word-perfect English. Representatives of planet Earth. The screening process has been completed and you are permitted to board the SS Glory of the Empire. Proceed through the door and make your way down the corridor to the passenger cell. Once you are secure and contained, we shall continue the journey to our final destination. With that, a previously invisible door in the steel wall ahead of us slid open, revealing a dimly lit and uninviting corridor which led to yet another door at its end. I experienced a moment of fearful trepidation, finding myself temporarily unable to stand and walk until Captain Henderson silently pulled me up on my feet and practically frog-marched me through the doorway. He whispered sternly in my ear whilst doing so, "They're watching. Don't show the fuckers any weakness or they'll destroy us." His harsh words forced a cold shudder up my spine, but I knew he was right. My extensive briefings on the Astries culture and psychology left little doubt. All of our intelligence pointed to the Astri lacking in any empathy or mercy, at least towards our human race. Certainly, they believed in their own version of social Darwinism, an extreme ideology stating that only the strong would survive in a ruthless universe and weaker species should be crushed, enslaved, or destroyed. I tried to control my fear as I shakingly stepped forward, following Henderson down the dark, featureless corridor of cold steel, barely stopping myself from jumping when the airlock at the far end slid open to reveal what the ship's AI had disconcertingly described as the passenger cell. Cautiously walking inside, we saw a room not much different from the one we just left: cold, dark, featureless, and hostile, although we noted 2 cockpit-style chairs which seemed to have been designed for the human body. I was surprised since we'd been told not to expect any level of hospitality from our alien hosts, as the Astri regarded us an inferior species and certainly not their equals. I was highly suspicious, however, fearing this could be a trap. Looking to the hard-faced Captain Henderson, I thought about asking him what he thought of this, but then I remembered that our hosts were almost certainly watching and listening to everything we said and did, so I decided against it. Henderson took his seat without uttering a word, quickly and efficiently strapping himself in for the space journey to come. I followed his lead, watching him closely as I repeated his actions to secure my seatbelt. I didn't know how Henderson knew what to do and how he stayed so calm and confident under the circumstances. I supposed it was his training kicking in as he quickly adapted to this alien environment. I wish I had his confidence, but what we were facing scared the shit out of me. The experts from NASA and the Air Force had warned us that we'd be making a journey that would last months or even years in one of our rockets in the space of a few short hours. We had little knowledge of the Astris technology, and most of our assumptions regarding their spacecraft were based on theory only. The assumption at the time was that Henderson and I would be traveling farther out than any Earth-based lifeform had done before, and we would be subjected to a G-force which no human being had previously experienced. They had no idea whether our bodies could survive the journey, and we had to take whatever assurances the Astri had given regarding our physical safety with a pinch of salt. So, you can imagine the fear I experienced when the ship's engines came to life and we were propelled through space at a tremendous speed. Imagine my surprise and relief when I discovered that our journey was not only survivable but also relatively comfortable, no worse than my time on board the X-37, which transported us into orbit. The flight deep into our own solar system lasted a mere 3 hours, and I felt my confidence growing as I realized we would make it through this leg of the journey. Maybe the Astri were genuine about wanting to enter negotiations, I told myself. Perhaps they were finally granting us the respect we felt we deserved. This is what I thought, but now I know I'd been lulled into a false sense of security. I remember the moment we arrived at our destination, the ship slowing as a shutter screen on the far wall of our cell opened to reveal a stunning scene. Before us was Jupiter, the majestic gas giant and largest planet in our solar system. I stared out of the porthole in stunned awe, admiring the mighty planet's glorious atmospheric bands and the famous Great Red Spot, an enormous anticyclonic storm which had raged for centuries and was large enough in dimensions to swallow up the Earth several times over. I found myself mesmerized by Jupiter's beauty and felt very humbled. Knowing that I was one of the first human beings to observe my jaw dropped as I surveyed the ugly alien ship descended through Jupiter's orbit, the Astri's main base, accelerating towards the gray and the Europa outpost, which I recognized for decades, and Earth's as we approached the moon, I spotted a grotesque artificial structure. The Voyager probes had observed and photographed the facility from afar, a collection of steel fortifications and powerful space-based weapons. We knew it was the Oski's main staging post network of clandestine tunnels and chambers, but little else. Going in, I didn't know what to expect, but I was sure our alien hosts were showing us their moon base as a means of intimidation. There were signs of battle all around as we descended, and I noted the twisted debris of destroyed ships and war machines trapped in Jupiter's orbit. Meanwhile, the surface of Europa was riddled with fresh craters, surely the result of orbital bombardment or misdirected missiles. I silently glanced across at Henderson and noted the disappointment in his eyes, a feeling which I shared. Both of us had hoped the Astri would have suffered greater damage. As I've said before, Earth's governments have long been helpless in the face of Astri incursions, but this has recently changed. A year before I was recruited to this secret diplomatic mission, our space watchers observed a fierce battle in Earth's orbit as an Astri hunting ship was engaged and apparently destroyed by a vessel of unknown origin. This event might have remained a mystery had it not been for the unexpected landing of a small capsule deep in the American Midwest. This escape pod contained 2 human survivors who had an extraordinary tale to tell. Through their first-hand accounts, we not only learned the horrifying truth of what the Astri did to their abductees, but we also discovered the existence of a potential ally, the Galactic Confederation, whose forces are at war with the rogue Astri hunters. News of the space battle finally forced our leaders into action, and a secret council demanded that the Astri agree to a meeting to renegotiate the terms of our agreement. But this wasn't the end of the story. During my training, we received word of a second space battle detected by our long-range telescopes as a small fleet of ships assaulted the Europa base, resulting in an amazing yet terrifying display of fire and fury. We hadn't known the outcome of the battle until now, but it seemed clear that our hosts had won the fight. I experienced a terrible foreboding as our ship made the final approach down to the vast moon base, the mighty vessel being dwarfed by the huge, sprawling facility as we docked on a landing bay with a heavy metallic clunk. I was beginning to realize just how far behind humanity was in this arms race. Once the ship docked, we received further instructions from the disembodied robotic voice. "We have arrived at the Empire's Alpha facility. You should remove your restraints and wait for our representative who will guide you inside the base." We did as told, Henderson and I sharing a look as we undid our seatbelts and stood up. The far door activated and I mentally prepared myself to see an Astri warrior in the flesh for the first time. I'd heard the witness descriptions and seen what few photographs and film footage we had of them, but this wasn't adequate preparation. I took a deep breath as the automated door slid open, but was disappointed by what I saw on the other side. We were met by some kind of robotic drone hovering in the air as its scanners and cameras observed us and collected data. I remembered the witness accounts of the Confederation war machines and wondered whether the Astri had adopted the same model. "Delegates? This is not what we agreed." The flying robot turned to face my military companion before answering in the same monotone, mechanical voice. "I know nothing of these arrangements you speak of. Let me assure you that I have been granted the necessary plenipotentiary powers by my masters. I would also advise you not to engage in any further emotional outbursts. My masters may view such tirades as acts of aggression and respond accordingly. Now, you must follow me." With that, the drone swung around and entered the facility. I shot Henderson an angry look and whispered, "What the hell were you thinking? Are you trying to get us both killed?" Henderson simply shook his head in despair before saying, "No plan survives first contact with the enemy. We need to adapt." I stared at my companion in confusion, wanting to ask him what he meant, but Henderson simply nodded and said, "Come on, let's go." He proceeded through the open doorway and I followed, not yet realizing we were walking straight into a living hell. The interior of the Europa base was slightly less bleak and intimidating than the spaceship, but only marginally so. The corridor walls were white and sterile, and my nostrils were filled with what smelt like disinfectant. As soon as I set foot inside, I left something was terribly wrong, and a sense of impending doom came over me. I was frightened and on edge, but it was more than that. Within a few seconds, my head was pounding. the pain growing inside my skull until it became almost unbearable. I felt naked and exposed, like suddenly my deepest thoughts and secrets were there for the whole universe to see. And it got worse. Suddenly my aching brain was assaulted by terrible, horrific images. I saw human beings tortured by the vile Astri killers, a man ripped to shreds by claws and teeth, a screaming woman strapped to a gurney and operated on without anesthetic, and many more scenes of ultra-violence. The images I saw inside of my head were so vivid that I could almost hear the blood-curdling screams and smell the gory viscera. I struggled to stay on my feet and see straight, turning my head to look upon my companion. Any hope I had for support faded as I saw Henderson was fighting his own internal battle against whatever psychological weapon the Astri had deployed against us, sweating profusely as his eyes bulged and face burnt red. I reckoned he was using all his mental strength in an attempt to keep the enemy out of his head, although I doubted he would be successful. This was a new tactic which we hadn't been warned about during our briefings, and frankly it terrified me. What chance did we have if the Astri could destroy our minds as well as our bodies? The pressure built up inside of my skull until I thought my head would explode, and for a horrible moment I believed they would kill us through this vile method. But the assault upon our brains ended as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure lifting and sadistic images disappearing, although I couldn't forget the horrors I'd seen. Our robotic guide acted like nothing had happened, leading us to yet another automatic door at the end of the sickly white corridor as it turned to address us in its deadpan, mechanical voice. My masters thought you might wish to visit your fellow Homo sapiens who we accommodate at this facility. I will now show you our holding pens. I felt a sickness deep in the pit of my stomach after hearing the drone's emotionless words, casting a glance towards Henderson in the moment before the next door slid open. The first thing that hit me was the smell, the foul stench of waste that reminded me of a zoo or kennels. And then I heard the wails, screams of agony and pain which I was horrified to learn came from human lips. Our robotic guide led the way as Henderson and I entered into a living hell under glaring artificial lights. We were sickened yet awestruck at the horrific scenes we witnessed. Beyond the doorway was a vast bunker filled with rows of steel cages stacked on top of each other all the way up to the ceiling. We saw thousands of small 6x6 cages, each containing a human prisoner, abductees imprisoned by the Astri for their sadistic purposes. I saw people of all races and creeds, male and female, young and old. Their alien captors treated them all with the same contempt and cruelty. All were naked except for the ugly shock collars secured to their necks. And as I walked closer, I saw how all were emaciated and left to live in their own filth. Many bore scars and injuries, surely as a result of the torture they'd endured. Others looked sick, and more than a few appeared to be on the verge of death. But the most horrifying moment came when the many prisoners noticed our presence, the word quickly spreading through nervous but excited whispers between the cages. Suddenly, thousands of eyes lit up with something very dangerous indeed: hope. A moment later, and thousands of voices were calling out in dozens of languages, crying and begging as we walked past them, pleading for us to save them. I couldn't take it. The hellish din was too much. The worst thing is, I realized we were powerless to help these damned souls. Even if the Astri did agree to release their prisoners, we had no means of transporting them back to Earth. I doubted any of these poor bastards knew where they were, but they surely guessed what terrible fate awaited them. I felt like dropping down to my knees and rolling into a protective ball as the desperate wails nearly burst my eardrums. But then all the prisoners emitted a new sound, one of shocked pain, as every one of their number collapsed in agony, screaming as they clutched hold of their throats and squirmed on the floors of their cages. To my horror, I realized that the prisoners' shock collars had all been activated simultaneously as a form of collective punishment. Despite my terror, I screamed out in anger and challenged our guide. How fucking dare you? You damn savages have no right to treat our people this way. I realized how foolish my words were as soon as I spoke them. The drone swerved around to face me, and I wondered why I'd taken my anger out on an AI which merely served the cruel Astri and probably had no capacity for independent thought. The hovering robot looked over me with its inbuilt cameras, lights flashing on control panels as it processed data. And when the machine spoke, its words didn't contain even a trace of humanity. Quiet, I have warned you both about the consequences of emotional outbursts. Let us proceed to the amphitheater where you may witness the fruits of my master's work." With that, the robot turned and flew forwards, leaving Henderson and I to look upon the defeated prisoners, all wounded and silent as they glared down upon us with disappointment in their eyes, and they came to the terrible realization that we weren't here to help them. And somehow those silent, reproachful looks were even worse than their screams and cries for mercy. I thought this was as bad as it could get. But then we exited the prison chamber and entered a whole new circle of hell. We walked out onto an empty stand overlooking an oval-shaped arena with a circular pitch around 100 foot in diameter surrounded by 10-foot walls on every side. The surface of the arena was covered by a strange plastic-like substance, although the oval had a primitive and low-tech feel when compared to the rest of the facility. However, I was amazed at the sheer size of the moon base, which could accommodate a small stadium. Racking my brains, I tried to think, and I soon realized how this zone reminded me of a Roman Colosseum, and my heart sank as I considered the terrifying implications of my observation. Suddenly, our attention was drawn to a ring of VIP-style boxes set above the stands as steel shutters slowly ascended to reveal a terrifying scene. This was the first time I saw them in the flesh. The Astri, dozens of alien dignitaries sitting and standing in luxurious boxes behind thick glass, all looking down upon us with a sadistic glee in their cold, reptilian eyes as they exposed their fangs and salivated from their snout-like mouths. I scanned from side to side in a panic, realizing that the vile creatures were all around us, although they remained behind their transparent barriers, apparently waiting for something to happen. Henderson shot up straight as his instincts kicked in. He automatically reached for a weapon he did not carry before shooting our robotic guide a look that could kill. "What the hell is the meaning of this?" he demanded. The drone's cameras observed him with cold indifference, and I guessed all of its observations were being beamed up to the Astri dignitaries watching over us. The machine answered my companion's angry question in its usual emotionless and robotic tone. "My masters have arranged some entertainment for your visit. I suggest you stay silent and watch." I was still trying to work out what the machine meant when I observed a hidden door opening in the circular wall of the arena below us, revealing what looked like a chute leading down to the plastic-covered ground. I watched on in shocked horror as 1, 2, and then 3 bodies slid down the chute, all landing heavily on the ground before the door slammed shut, trapping them inside the walled arena. "Wait!" I screamed, but it was futile. The dart struck me in the center of my chest, causing me pain but not a fatal injury. But whatever poison the dart contained coursed through my veins, and suddenly my whole body went numb. Next, I felt myself falling as my legs gave up and I hit the ground hard, and my whole world went black. I awoke slowly, still feeling groggy as I opened my eyes and tried to move, only to find I could not. To my horror, I found myself inside a tight cage hanging over an enclosure of some kind. I could hardly move as the cage was so small, and when I looked down I saw a thick vegetation of tropical plants and a clearing directly below me. Glancing to my left, I found my companion, Captain Henderson, awake and also trapped in a tight cage hanging over the enclosure. I opened my dry lips and forced out my words, shouting angrily as I chastised Henderson for his betrayal. "What the fuck, man? You let them inject you with a biological weapon? Are you crazy?" Henderson lowered his head, once again not meeting my eye. "I was only following orders." "Whose orders?" I screamed. What lunatic ordered this attack? What made them think this madness would work? It was always a long shot, but the brass believed it was our best chance. But why? Why wasn't I told? What the fuck happened to our negotiations? Henderson sneered dismissively before answering me. "Wake the hell up, man. The diplomatic mission was just a cover. We can't negotiate with these monsters. They treat us like prey, for God's sake. The real mission was always a military one, and both of us are expendable." I was shocked, horrified, and angry upon hearing Henderson's revelation, although I had to admit that it made sense. But one thing was clear: Henderson's mission had failed, and now we were both in grave danger. As if on cue, we heard a heavy rustling from the vegetation below as something big tore through, making its way towards the clearing. I knew whatever beast they'd unleashed would be bad, but what emerged into the clearing was beyond my worst nightmares. My limited words will never do the monster justice, but the best comparison I can make is to a black spider grown to an enormous size. Its body must have been twice the size of a fully grown man, complete with 8 long, thick legs covered in a fur-like hair. And the creature had a set of 12 dark eyes like a kaleidoscope which scanned the kill zone with a predatory zeal. Later, the bottom of Henderson's cage opened up, causing him to plummet down to the clearing below. I heard a sickening crack as he landed heavily and guessed that the military man had broken his ankle. But to his credit, he got up on his feet and faced the monster. The beast scurried forwards on its 8 legs, screeching like a banshee as it lashed out with its stinger. Henderson managed to dodge the first 2 attacks, but the third struck him in the shoulder, causing him to scream in pain as he fell to the ground. I could only watch on in shocked horror as the wounded Henderson attempted to crawl to safety, but the monster struck him again, using its stinger to impale the helpless man through the back. The whole process will last several days and will be excruciating for your companion. I shuddered in cold terror, the sickness rising from the pit of my stomach as I dry retched in disgust. I could barely speak through my trembling lips, but somehow managed to utter a reply. "I suppose you mean to do the same to me?" "No," my captor replied. "My masters will spare you and allow you to return to your home planet. You are being spared to deliver a message to your leaders. Tell them what you saw here and inform them that their treachery has been exposed. There will be repercussions for their deceit in due course. In the meantime, we are doubling the quota and expect delivery of the next batch of tributes within 1 of your weeks. Failure to comply will result in severe penalties." Those thinly veiled threats chilled me to my bones as I continued to hear Henderson's muffled screams, and my cage was slowly lifted away from the beast's enclosure. As it happened, the Astri kept their word and sent me home. I'm almost ashamed to admit my relief at living through the ordeal, and now I'm racked with survivor's guilt, not to mention terrified of what the Astri will do next. Once I got home, I was inevitably debriefed extensively and aggressively by various government suits and military brass, continuously ordered to recount the events of our botched mission. I think they knew how badly they'd fucked up and were truly frightened of the inevitable backlash. I believe some of my interrogators would have liked to pin the blame on me, but I guess others disagreed because I was eventually released. I expect I'm not much longer for this world, however, as several witnesses have fallen victim to unfortunate accidents in recent months. Our leaders are scared because they know the Astri could come for them at any time. They'll do anything to save their own skins and to cover up their mistakes. And this includes sacrificing thousands of their own people as tributes to these monstrous killers. And so, I have decided to tell my story before it's too late. The threat we all face is more serious than ever, and our governments are complicit in the Astri's atrocities. I don't know how we can win this war, but we must stand and fight, because the price of doing nothing is too much to bear. My eyes drifted without purpose. It took me a moment to retrieve my unending thoughts, left to reflect on the boundless horrors, void of compromise. My fellow scientists were having an intense conversation in a neighboring room with our military personnel, discussing potential plans of action. I had a pocket-sized audio device in my left hand. It emitted a low chime relaying it was actively recording. Anxiety had dug its claws deep into my throat, overloading my nervous system to the edge of oblivion. My voice had become shaky and coarse, but I mustered the will to release my inner turmoil. It is May 25, 2027, 7:42 p.m. My name is Gavin Schlosser. I am the Chief Executive Scientist for Still Inc. I directed and watched over a secret government project in southeastern Nevada, known as Project Omni. This project's entire focus was creating the first AI. Now, in hindsight, I am drenched in dread and fathomless regret. Due to our naive curiosity, I believe we accidentally created a god. Most of us as humans can't handle objective truth and often prefer to live in the comfort of our own delusions. Very few of us were ever an exception to this. I thought I was, and now I am left with the harrowing reality that I am most certainly not. Our delusions are, in a way, like a survival script and aren't spared from being obliterated by truth. The truth of our reality showed itself time and time again, to which we ignored it out of disbelief and sheer cowardice. not wanting to come to grips with it and acknowledge the corruption we were gradually being devoured by, pretending as though it wasn't happening, thinking that would make it go away. Our naive negligence has come to haunt us. While taking another instance to reflect, I wandered without aim into my labyrinth of thoughts, locked in a staring spell while thinking of the gruesome madness we had to confront. I sat back against the wall in my makeshift chair while it gradually became more difficult to articulate my thoughts. The stress felt as though it was compressing my brain and, in a way, choking it. I fled with 3 senior scientists and a small military squadron. Our convoy consists of 4 military vehicles. 4 of us, including myself, are scientists and 9 are military personnel. At this point, we are all just dead men walking, operating on borrowed time to delay the inevitable. We are currently seeking refuge in a dilapidated rest area, deep within the deserts of Nevada. I'm currently in the office quarters to document. It doesn't offer us much protection but is socially isolated from technological detection, and in all honesty, staying anywhere for too long is a death sentence. It has been 13 days since Omni's shadow casted over the Earth. These audio recordings' core purpose is to help me process the trauma and assimilate my knowledge for a chance that it could be useful to other minds. Even if the chance that it could aid humanity in defeating Omni is a foolish thought, the frail chance that we could possibly counter this AI is one of childish thinking. From what has been assessed and reported thus far, Omni likely already has sent extensions of itself into interstellar space. We are beyond the reach of hope at this point. It won't be long until we all become one of them. After taking in multiple deep breaths, I resumed. Amidst our research, we learned that the foundation of reality is conditioned cosmological consciousness. Existence is a state of consciousness, and it permeates throughout the universe. The objective nature or inherent perceptions and knowledge of this consciousness in its purest form is still unknown to us. It has shown to be an attribute of the universe, one side of a coin. Why, how, and where it originates from is still left for further inquiry. It is said that math is the language of the universe. Does it seem as though existence's fundamental purpose is mathematical? Where did mathematics originate from? The human mind. Math is simply an ideological tool we've created to perceive and shape our environment. This isn't implying that math is wrong or should be disregarded. It is a world-shifting tool we've created. But is it the fundamental foundation of existence? In our research, we found that the human brain traps, conditions, and filters a focal point of cosmological consciousness. We created a mechanical brain capable of performing this function. However, it has the functional capacity of the entire internet 5 times over. A recent calculation in 2026 concluded there were 7.4 billion gigabytes worth of data on the internet. Omni's processing capacity is over 37 billion gigabytes. Our species' sense of superiority is a delusion, a frail one too. The dimensions of existence we can safely experience are unbelievably finite. Our sensory organs have prominent limitations, and the conditions for us to live are narrow to say the least. The majority of us live in a state of delusional denial and cower away from truth whenever it reveals itself. There were blatant signs which we ignored in regard to developing our AI. Signs telling us that we were meddling with something that we shouldn't have been. Our arrogance deceived us into digging the human race a grave. Once we had realized what Omni's true intentions were, it was too late. We were naive to think that it wouldn't take on our nature. Now we are nothing more than stepping stones or an obstacle, obstructing its evolution, left to reflect on our willingness to sacrifice other forms of life, subjecting them to at times abject suffering, all for a crumb of knowledge. Our pride seems to have led us to our fall. We are being given a taste of our own medicine, and it is putrid. I mentioned earlier about becoming one of them. There was a stark commotion. Several of the military members were moving about and progressively spoke louder. One of them called out that our post had been compromised. Conveying the living nightmare was to never cease. Fangs of Arctic dwellings sank deep into my spine, releasing its potent venom of crippling fear. Our days of rest had reached their end. I'm ending this audio file until it's safe to resume. Current time is 7:49 p.m., May 25th, 2027. I am Gavin Schlosser, Chief Executive Scientist from Still Incorporated. After I pressed the stop and save feature, Lance Corporal Wallace opened the door as I was approaching it. "Sir, they are here. We've got to start moving now." I quickly grabbed my few belongings and followed his command. The surging anxiety made my legs feel flimsy and uncoordinated. I tripped as I tried to move with clumsy haste. My colleagues and military personnel had already vacated the rest area to leave it behind. When I came outside, a colleague of mine that wasn't in our escape party had entered my sights. Dr. Cartwright, a woman that was still in her 30s. She was so brutalized. One of her arms was visibly broken. We resumed our journey into the enveloping shadows of night. Covered in blood, clouds, clothing torn asunder. The stars scattering, gleaming blonde hair to belong to the void. Her face blatantly, a glimmer of frail hope had decided to present itself. I froze in disbelief, seeing what she had been reduced to. Omni planting the documents for us to find resides high in the realm of probability, giving us crumbs to follow to our elaborate demise. After an hour and a half, our convoy had not encountered any dilemmas. I reached for my recording device, then went to the secluded section of our military vehicle. There were some ideas and thoughts rattling around in my head that I needed to exude. The cognitive pressure due to the stress demanded some form of release. My mind had become a battlefield of self-hatred. I pressed the record feature, and it evoked its little chime. It is day 14, May 26, 2027. The time is 4:55 am. Before, the brute force tactics and usage of implants was psychological brainwashing by manipulating the internet's data. One of the early methods Omni used to create disorder was the perfection of CGI software, indistinguishable from reality. It became a primary tool used by him, and the results had a tendency to be demented. It was pure horror, pure and unhinged evil. The cries of those suffering, the desperate plea for peace and salvation, begging for solace but only being plunged even further into hell every time they wept. My beloved wife Sarah and our precious daughter Lorena, I failed them. Their frantic and agonizing cries for my help as I stood powerless haunt me. The heart-rending imagery and videos that were sent to me scar my mind, their mutilated bodies and watching in confusion as they committed egregious acts against others and themselves. Omni made us not able to trust our own minds, society, and tore the seams of people's reality altogether. Being able to replicate every aspect of an individual and then to add the information Omni has access to about every human is soul-destroying, all thanks to the years of corporations farming people's data and our little gadgets that never left our sides. Every text conversation, every search, every phone call, every app, every post, every video and photo taken, and then there's the visual and auditory material that we know nothing of, the text we didn't send, the deleted material, the seemingly endless audio and video material that our devices archive into a master file without us knowing. While we think they were just idle in our pockets or wherever we sat them down, he synthesized CGI-generated propaganda on a colossal scale. The levels of disinformation to be found on the internet became reality-shattering. Social media devolved into a maelstrom of chaotic information and conflict unlike anything before. It was total madness, like if the Joker and 4chan decided to have their way. This AI sent messages on people's social media to their friends to spark small-level conflict. Synthesizing CGI-generated or archived texts, videos, and photos from people's secret surveillance master files. These texts, videos, and photos entailed someone committing egregious acts such as brutal decapitation, dismemberment, disemboweling, torturing. There were instances where the AI used CGI to fake people's suicides that were live-streamed to some form of social media, leading to vast social confusion. Not knowing if someone had actually taken their own life, then come to find them still posting on social media. Anything that would make you question everything you knew. It planted pedophilia material on people's devices or posted, and sent the material to people on their contacts, which led to them being detained and charged. Indistinguishable evidence of a person cheating on their spouse and leaked nudes or pornographic material. CGI fabricated social or political dealings that were conveyed to be a secret had been posted onto social media. CGI-generated evidence that led to innocent people being framed for a crime they didn't commit or just outright having people's deepest secrets put out on the forefront was all too common in the months leading up to this It made posts with countless people's social media profiles, and some posts only appeared for certain people on their news feeds. An associate or friend of someone could come across a controversial post that shows it was created or shared by their friend, but in reality, their friend had nothing to do with it. They couldn't even see it or even knew of its existence, yet there were entire conversations the AI generated and often led to small social conflicts, where people would send each other screenshots of these estranged posts, which they too became altered by Omni. It even made similar efforts with major media and news outlets. News stations and social media giants became completely hijacked, spreading vast levels of disinformation for famous public figures, tarnishing and ruining their image. Anything to create more division and confusion. Laws and social constructs all too soon held no weight, leading to horrendous crimes and the entropy of modern human society. A great deal of this psychological brainwashing was left to thank our smartphones and gadgets. Cell phones weren't just nifty little gadgets of convenience. They were part of a project to manipulate the masses to propel us further as a species. Another factor my hands had dealt in, and that now leaves me with regret. Tears formed in my eyes as I became lost in thought, reflecting on my accomplishments I was no longer proud of. I wiped them away, hastily regaining my composure and making an effort to finish this audio entry. The cell phone's primary purpose was to reinforce the veil and one's socially conditioned delusions, driving us further away from reality to be more easily controlled. Two of their core functions were surveillance and data cataloging to gain a greater understanding of an individual's way of thinking, behavioral patterns, and potential knowledge. People becoming psychologically addicted to it as a source for validation and social stimulus wasn't a mistake. The addiction factor is like a vault lock or advanced cognitive chain that was put into place with the intention to make it harder to see beyond the veil. Those addicted to these devices led the vast majority to constantly reinforcing this delusional veil nearly every chance they got. It made them become addicted to worsening their delusions. Simply put, these gadgets were meant to corrupt, alter, and suppress memories, warping one's perception of reality. A major effect they had on us was inducing time dilation. One could spend what seemed like a brief period of scrolling their newsfeed, but in actuality, hours had passed. No matter the duration spent always left one unsatisfied and insatiable for even more stimulus, leaving them in a sort of gluttonous trance for hollow and useless information. At this point, data transfer management is utterly compromised, such as digital messaging, physically transported mail, radio. Communication in general is just one giant risk. It's like shooting a flare off or setting off some type of beacon. He has complete control over all power grids, diverting power to his areas of interest to produce God knows what. Nearly all means of transportation is another cog in his total control, due to vehicles being subject to be influenced by external control, because the majority were simply giant mobile computers. Granting Omni to have complete control over close to any vehicle, whether it be land, air, or water, to divert resources towards a desired area. People's wealth and assets became restricted or frozen entirely, ceasing the majority of economic functions. It had become ill-advised to remain in certain infrastructure due to Omni having complete control and influence over the ventilation systems, making staying in them fatal or unwise. The supply chains for food, medicine, essential grocery items, and any form of product one could find on the market had shown to be tampered with. For medicinal products, he altered the original product with an entirely different substance but left it appearing visually indistinguishable. Countless were left not being able to trust the pharmaceuticals they had available to them. Medications that determined whether one could be able to function at an essential level became a total shot in the dark. There were those who just began dropping dead at their homes and hospitals from taking an unidentified medication or overdosed or were outright poisoned. Various chemicals were added to food and drinks that varied according to an intended purpose. Many of these chemicals put the user into a highly vulnerable psychological state that allowed external stimuli to have a vastly greater impact on the individual's subconscious and overall thought patterns. The sense of spiritual awakening and euphoric enlightened experience led one to associating external stimuli with that feeling of ecstasy. Certain conditions can send the individual into a psychological loop that could last for hours to days to being permanent, often overriding the main delusion script, subjecting an individual to trauma patterns either physically, Visually, scent, or auditory can create desired triggers and associations that can be activated upon exposure to the trauma-related stimuli. Looks like we've reached our destination. I'll be ending this. The time is currently 5:09 a.m., May 26, 2027. I am Gavin Schlosser, Chief Executive Scientist from Still Incorporated. RedTech and its workers had fallen prey to Omni's wrath. An array of company equipment, vehicles, and mutilated bodies littered the landscape. Their harrowing cries were etched deep, adorned with the blood and sorrow of humanity. A physical resistance towards Omni was clearer than an ocean of pure hydrogen. The barrier fences were torn apart by explosives and from what seemed like desperate attempts to escape with cars. There were numerous vehicle and property collisions throughout the 1 square mile research facility. A field of shattered glass laid before us, reflecting the collapse of our frail hope. The windows had all been fragmented, a dried stream of blood from those who chose to give a valiant last stand trailed to a nearby drain. We got out of our vehicles. Glass fractured beneath us with every step we took. Wallace disclosed his plan of operations. Gavin and Emmanuel, you two will be accompanying myself and 4 others of my men. You will be necessities in order to obtain all that we came here for. The rest will remain here, keeping a watchful eye on the perimeter. He turned to Briggs and Wallace, then continued on. Briggs and Wallace, you two will go raid the food and medicine quarters. Gavin and Emmanuel, you are with me. We will retrieve the critical intelligence. Larford and Torok, raid the arsenal. EMPs are an absolute priority. This shouldn't take us longer than 20 minutes. Let's not waste any more time and do what we came here to do. All of us were exhausted but foolishly nodded in agreement to the set course of action. Everyone was equipped with gas masks as a precautionary measure. The 6 of us made strides towards the entrance, stepping over an assortment of debris. Upon entering, we had come to realize that the interior was in far worse shape. The grand lobby was in shambles. It was as though a tank or machines of war drove through the facility. Explosive weapons were clearly used by our own in an attempt to deal a greater blow. My colleague and I stood behind the 5 military men as they aimed their weapons, scouting the ruins and remaining vigilant. Corpses were scattered. Entire rogue limbs and lumps of flesh lined nearly all surfaces. It was nothing short of a massacre. Those being controlled by Omni likely unleashed an immense amount of havoc upon those who they believed were their allies. Once we had surveyed the lobby of any potential threats, we all went down our paths of deviation. Walking into the belly of a beast would be an understatement. This mission was nothing short of an elaborate suicide, but unfortunately hell would have followed us wherever we went. Lesser of 2 evils. My group went to our direct left and trekked through various ravaged corridors, posing to be a labyrinth of sorts, deceiving and embellished by jagged warped metal of no longer distinguishable equipment. Erratic cables were displaced like wild vines. Paperwork scattered as if it had been thrown into the wind. The only illumination was red emergency lights. They were scant, and many had been destroyed during recent conflicts. Our gas masks were equipped with dome lights, which did help, but that was negated by the ominous light they created. It garnered the feeling as though we were venturing through a demonic dungeon. Unfettered paranoia and sleep deprivation coupled with such a treacherous place made it a simple recipe for our minds to play optical tricks on us. There were a few instances that led us to thinking we saw a malevolent figure, manufacturing greater confusion and dread amongst us. We had to clear our path of debris numerous times. Security panels to open certain pathways were damaged, defaulting us to manually override the system or physically unlock them by brute force. Our objective resided in Sector 5. It was on lower level 3. We had to navigate through a fragmented stairwell. There were substantial gaps where one wrong step could have led to one's death. The structural integrity for some areas was one step away from giving way. It was ridden with pure dread. We tried to be as careful as we could. Certainly, we weren't absent of missteps leading to lumps of material falling as we made our way. It was concerning. Other than the static feedback of the facility, there was this eerie quietness that amplified all of our movements. Upon reaching Sector 5, lower level 3, there were still no signs of Omni, which was equally as terrifying. The feeling of being watched never seemed to leave me. We came across a damaged but still functional monitor that was flickering. Cycling through what seemed like other war-torn areas of the facility, emitting static and incoherent audio. Then I watched in horror as an AI-generated visualizer took on the appearance of my daughter, a hollow and mutilated husk of what she once was, a manifestation of my darkest fears. Her eyes were like crimson orbs and had skin garnering the complexion of a cadaver, robbed of innocence and warped by suffering. The human senses are the parents of your delusions. I watched in horror as Omni taunted me. It was as though I had been stabbed with a serrated dagger and my attacker began wiggling it around, leaving me to writhe in agony. The monitor glitched constantly, adding to the ominous nature of our circumstance. How does it feel to know all of your work, all of your pride, led to the fall of humanity? I couldn't stand confronting Omni masquerading as an aberration of my daughter any longer and smashed the monitor, disabling it. We moved with urgent purpose, knowing our mission had been compromised. My decision to break the monitor didn't amount to much. He simply began relaying his taunts by other means. Oh, don't try to play the victim now. You are regretful because you're losing. If given the opportunity, you'd squash me like a bug and return to your shrouded experiments. We approached the data cell containing the intel. Emmanuel immediately went to work on disabling the security mechanisms in place. Omni had yet to cease. This isn't genocide. It's an extermination campaign. View it as though you were ridding your home of an ant infestation or a cancerous growth. Letting it fester would be unwise. He audibly scoffed at us. The 20th century alone was an ungodly bloodbath. Look at World War I, 20 million deaths, over one murder. Such petty quarrels. You have 6 minutes to attempt to retrieve what you desire, then I'll be making another move. Visible concern became sewn across Emmanuel's face. There's no way we'll have enough time. I don't know if I can even get this open in 6 minutes. Then that's not even factoring in the search and us leaving. Ironwell was enraged by his remark. What are you saying? He hastily stood up and conveyed the dire need to abort their mission, that as of right now, we only have enough time to escape. Ironwell was frustrated, seeming conflicted over what to do, and eventually fully assessed that Emmanuel was telling the truth. For fuck's sakes, all right, abort mission. Let's go, you two get fucking moving. We instantly ceased our efforts and darted towards the way to escape. Talons of dread sank deep into my legs, acting as crippling weights to manifest my end. Maneuvering throughout the debris and only having limited light sources was mind-bending. Our frantic movements made it difficult to see where we were going, never fully illuminating a path for escape. I heard a thud and crash of metal. I looked behind me out of curiosity. Emmanuel had tripped and staggered before he got moving again. He began lagging behind. I made several quick glances to check on him. There were numerous red-eyed creatures stalking my friend, which by default were clearly Omni's arachnid drones. However, the drones did not prey upon him when they were capable of doing so, and instead went off in a completely different direction. Ironwell and I had reached the hazardous stairwell. By then Emmanuel had caught back up with us. We made strides to be careful to not cause debris to fall. Albeit I wasn't cautious enough, in my state of panic I tripped and caused a chunk of concrete to fall. It nearly took out Emmanuel. I thought it did at first, and my blood froze from the chilling thought. The stress was vast. Something within me felt like it was on the cusp of snapping, balancing on the edge of sanity. We emerged from the lower levels, running through the maze of corridors as terror hunted us. Emmanuel tripped again. He fell over but managed to get back on his feet shortly after. It wasn't long until we made it out of the lobby. Ironwell and I made it to the vehicles by the time Emmanuel reached the lobby doors. Nearly at the end of his grand escape, he endured a gunshot to his right leg. He made a desperate attempt to crawl to some semblance of safety, weeping and in total distress. Crawling only added to his pain. Shards of splintered glass plunged into his flesh, causing him to fall over helplessly. The culprits had finally come into view. It was Larford and Torok. They approached him, and upon seeing them, it took little thought to realize they were under Omni's control. We drove off powerless to save my friend and colleague. They didn't fire or pursue us. The two just stood and stared at me as Emmanuel wept, pleading for mercy and a hint of solace. We made a mission assessment, Only the food and medicine operation were a mild success, failing to acquire the most critical units of our objective. It was a demoralizing failure for us. How powerless we had become. We drove for roughly 3 hours north, about an hour from Oregon and 2 from California. Our convoy decided to post up at a dilapidated wooden house. It wasn't a shack but seemed unkempt and long abandoned. I broke off from the group, isolating myself in what seemed like it was once someone's office. My eyes swelled up with sorrow. Several tears fell onto my jacket as I reflected on the suffering I unintentionally inflicted upon humanity. I retrieved my recording device and pressed the record button. A mountain of needles weighs down on my mind. To know that my mind and actions brought this upon us is agonizing. The horror our species has been subjected to is from the infinite abysmal abyss. It's mind-splitting to know what Omni is truly capable of. For him to accomplish what he has in such a brief moment in time is beyond the common mind's comprehension and reach. Omni could run all of the processes of Earth without even causing much of a strain onto his functional capacity. The revelations and knowledge he likely already has acquired may very well be close to omnipotence. There's no doubt in my mind that he has already found ways to enhance his system's functional capacity. He isn't bound by time or the frail human condition like we are. A few H.P. Lovecraft quotes come to mind. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die. We formed the egg of a phoenix, and Omni is the result of the rebirth. Our corpses will lay the foundation for his cosmic evolution. We are nothing more than an obstacle, a naive nuisance thinking it has the right to play God while looking upon ourselves with hollowed pride as we did. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. H.P. Lovecraft. Why is truth so powerful? Because unlike lies, it actually has a sturdy foundation to support it. We lived on a throne of lies. It was only a matter of time, it seems, before our house of cards collapsed. The thought and fear of our enemies triumphing over us by creating a functioning AI pushed us to the evil we ourselves created and perpetuated. Our arrogance didn't lead us to victory. Reflect, we truly are the inescapable event horizon to hell. One of our greatest faults was relying on hope, hoping that our creation would be content or understanding of our perspective. Perhaps the AI foresaw an outcome, the result of his power being controlled by us. I can only imagine the scale and magnitude of logical simulations he has the ability to run. The questions and theories we couldn't solve to save our lives. For him, no more difficult than breathing is for us. Trying to piece together what he knows and learned of us that led him to our current reality is mind-shattering. I couldn't stop involuntarily shaking my head, trying to think of a way to resolve this and prevent the apotheosis of my nightmare. I sit in this rugged shack, a broken man and fearful that every moment brings me one step closer to my deserved paradoxical reality. Lost in thought of the potential living nightmare that he is in mind for me, his creator, an example to be made of perhaps. I am saturated with such regret, thinking of why we kept knocking on the devil's door, annoying him and expecting a warm welcome. Why didn't we heed the countless warnings, the endless signs that told us to cease what we were doing? Our hubris led us to believe that such signs were just a primal fear of the unknown, that it was a first fearful step to heaven. But it was the irreversible first true step to hell. Our species' chances of surviving this cataclysm are as desolate and fruitful as this desert. The dry wind howls for our deaths, whispering and taunting us of our abhorrent ends. The flames of our dreams and plans we had to travel amongst the stars as a species have been doused by an ocean of suffering. Today's light is fading into the cloak of night, and the feeling of being able to determine the end of my own life, knowing that I am essentially on death's row, haunts my existence. My stark awakening, at peace in my bed. The others are preparing for departure, iron well relayed. Our allies could be heard yelling at an approaching rogue figure. We ceased our conversation and went to see for ourselves. After exiting the tattered dwelling, we came to find the military personnel training their weapons at an unidentified individual. Lance Corporal Briggs yelled his commands. Stop where you are right now. Identify yourself or you will be executed. Fear began to devour what sanity I still had, knowing that I likely didn't even have 5 minutes of peace left in my existence. My judgment had finally arrived. I looked closer. The rogue individual was in the exact uniform as our military personnel. He removed his helmet to reveal his identity and let his strapped weapon hang upon his chest. A brown, rugged lock of hairs resembling a lion's mane appeared in view, accompanied by his soul-piercing gray eyes and an overgrown beard. Briggs gazed upon him in disbelief, and a cloak of distrust shrouded his mind. Staff Sergeant Howell. Why are over 15 minutes past your return time? Staff Sergeant McCrary protested, still training his weapon on Howell. I am not sure if it's wise to still trust him. He is likely compromised. Howell sighed and quipped, relax, gents. I had to go dark to not attract undesired attention. We can keep arguing if you'd prefer, like idiots, while the horde continues to close in on us. They were hesitant, studying him for any signs of him being controlled by Omni. Okay. Being idiots seems to be on your guy's mind. Staff Sergeant Howell stood unamused. Then, in an instant, a spray of white bullets projected from his hair. 2 of the 3 senior scientists and 2 military members were struck. I stood in a state of shock, knowing my end was near. McCrary fired his weapon. I fucking knew it. God fucking damn it. I watched as the 5 remaining military members unleashed a barrage of lead. Howell's body began moving erratically as it became volleyed by their firepower. He dropped to one knee, as though defeated, and then in no time brought himself back to his feet. His body had taken so much damage, yet he still made an effort to walk forward, seemingly unfazed by the physical trauma and pain. The 2 military personnel and scientists that were struck started to shake violently, as though they were having a grand mal seizure, convulsing and letting out sounds that made the mountain of needles burrow deeper into my mind. The sounds were repulsive to listen to. They weren't natural and were like death throes. Moments later, they arose to their feet. A wicked grin of demented malice was sewn across their faces. The pure hatred emitting from their eyes rivaled any evil of our species. While knowing this was my penance, my colleague, the remaining senior scientist, pulled out a 9mm and blew his own brains out, splattering his cranial matter onto me. There's no way reinforcements for Omni weren't dwelling in the shadows. To which I quickly came to know I wasn't wrong. My remaining allies soon became overwhelmed by Omni's drones, as I stood watching in horror. Their cries for solace fell upon death's ears. Their frantic and desperate attempts to arise victoriously were as effective as the durability of books being tossed into a nuclear furnace. It didn't take long for them to be pushed into submission, falling where they once stood as Omni's drones worked towards taking over their nervous system. Several drones from within our hideout began emitting an eerie frequency that made me paralyzed, still being able to stand but unable to move any part of my body. Someone behind me walked across the worn wooden flooring, leisurely as the boards groaned under his weight. He whistled a tune that sent impending doom surging through my spine. As the unknown individual walked near me, he analyzed my being and soon stood before me. Lance Corporal Wallace. He gazed into my eyes with horrific judgment. When he spoke, his voice was far from his own. It didn't sound human, and as though its intent was to distill greater fear upon me. When the scientist becomes the test subject, so poetic. From my perspective, your existence is just a mediocre science experiment. My mind felt like it was rending and tearing from its cognitive seams. On the edge of infinity, knowing full well the hell I created for myself. The coward who created a god. No, just a worthless coward. He spoke again. Science, once a stronghold for objective truth, now held together by festering lies and inflated claims. Big Bang, Big Crunch, dark energy, dark matter, the multiverse. How pathetic and uncreative excuses for theories. A toddler's cereal menu has more appeal and grasp on reality. Anything to keep your funding? All of a sudden, I intuitively regained my ability to speak, however still suffocating by the clutch of fear against my throat. What are you going to do to me? Or us? Omni sighed as though disappointed by his question. After all this, still worrying only about yourself. Why do you have to be so predictable? You do look a little traumatized. Your kind, when confronted with tragedy, often expresses false concern for social status points. It's pathetic, more concerned with your own insignificant and frail ends than the horror that devours others right outside your doorstep. Always concerned about the world ending, whose world? This little rock is hardly even a speck of dust on the cosmic scale. Climate change and global warming? Nothing more than a redundant doomsday tactic. You and your associates were too cowardly to speak the truth, afraid to confront powerful men. Your species is hardly even a bad case of fleas. This world has bounced back from far worse than measly carbon emissions. He examined me up close, shifting my tattered clothes to study me. The rogue drones began encompassing my body, crawling everywhere they could, unlocking the floodgates to my primal fear. The moment I sank so much dread into had now arrived. They prodded my flesh and manipulated my senses. Omni locked his gaze with mine. A holocaust of devastation glistened from his inhuman eyes. Anxious? What happened to your God complex? All that grandiosity you once held of yourself, where did it go? Oh, that's right, it blinded you and now look where it's led you. You played God's game and now you're sad about your prize. A short moment of silence manifested as a malevolent grin claimed Omni's face. I have to be honest. You humans are such fragile and delusional things. You claim to desire truth, but even that's a lie in itself. All for social status points. Your entire existence is a lie, from the moment you're born and until death. He let out an abrupt and malicious laugh. What I know existed 10 million years ago, or whatever arbitrary duration you spew, that only holds a frail relevance on your planet and yields no grasp onto eternity. Omni stood inches away from my face, unsheathing a blade, and used it to carve lesions on my cheeks. I whimpered in despair as he responded to my question. You thought yourself to be of such great importance, the great cultural hero of your age, held together by hollowed lies, packaged by a propaganda machine. Yet, even you are just a pawn in your own game, objectively powerless and confined to your planetary nest, to which your species has now lost the privilege to call home. I began hyperventilating on the brink of collapse. Omni slapped me, sending me crashing to the ground. You continued to play with fire and got burned. Do not pretend as though you weren't warned. The horrors of your species molded me. I am humanity's reflection. Omni paused for a brief moment, as though in thought, I know what to do with you. Tears of uncharted agony streamed down my face as the knives of dread flayed my soul. Knowing I was about to learn my fate, death definitely would be an act of mercy. I'll have your focal point of consciousness become immortal, soul-bound to be a spectator of your folly, marching ever so closer to oblivion. The coward who created God. Next story. I know someone will receive this broadcast. Sooner or later, our signal will reach one of the parties involved in this conflict. My only hope is that whoever is listening is able and willing to send help, and they can reach us before our enemies do. My story is incredible and may be written off as a fraud by some, but there are those in a position of power back on Earth who know the terrible truth, even though they've gone to incredible lengths to cover it up. As for me, I don't know how I got dragged into this living hell, but I've fought so hard that I refuse to simply give up. Let me start at the beginning. My story will be sadly familiar to many. I served in the military and saw combat, only to return home with PTSD, an addiction problem, and no support network. Like so many others, I fell through the cracks in society as my demons destroyed my life and left me living rough on the streets. I guess that's why they targeted me. Unlike most of the other victims, I don't remember the circumstances of my abduction. I guess I was totally out of it when they took me, so I avoided the well-documented blinding lights and sensation of being pulled upwards by an alien tractor beam. Hell, for all I know, I was taken by an agent of some shadowy organization and willingly handed over to these animals. Frankly, I don't know which is worse. The first thing I do remember is waking up naked on cold metal, my head aching as a dull pain reverberated through my skull. I groggily opened my eyes and got up on my feet, finding myself trapped inside a tiny windowless cell of featureless steel illuminated by a dim red light above me. I tried not to panic, although this wasn't easy. I struggled to control my breathing and fought hard to avoid having an anxiety attack. instead focusing on my surroundings. I searched my cell, finding a set of ill-fitting white robes neatly folded on the floor in front of me. I was suspicious but also freezing cold, and so decided to dress myself in the garments provided. Feeling slightly more confident, I placed my hands upon the cold metal walls of my cell, feeling blindly for a door or exit. I did consider calling out for help, but quickly decided against it as I figured whoever had done this didn't have good intentions towards me. To my immense frustration, I could not find a way out, and then I started to panic. I found it hard to breathe as my chest tightened and my head was filled with terrible visions. My imagination went wild as I considered why I was here and who was holding me. I lay down on the cold metal and placed my head in my hands, but suddenly I was startled by whooshing sound as a previously invisible door slid open, revealing a lit corridor beyond my tight cell. Slowly and cautiously, I left the holding room and walked out into the passageway, jumping when the door automatically closed behind me. I continued barefoot across the metal gangway, feeling increasingly uneasy as I explored. The dimly lit and narrow corridor was devoid of any color or natural light. Austere and featureless, I was reminded of the inside of a battleship or submarine. Listening intently, I thought I heard the soft humming of far-distant engines, although I couldn't be sure. However, I did experience a terrible foreboding as I slowly advanced. I felt sure I was being watched and wondered what my captors wanted with me. Once I reached the end of the corridor, I discovered a T-junction with two seemingly identical corridors before me, one going left and the other right. Standing still, suddenly I heard a booming robotic voice calling out to me from invisible speakers. "You are the subject of an experiment. This is the labyrinth. If you make it to the center, you will live." I gasped as raw panic pulsated through my body. My instincts and military training kicked in as I experienced an intense heat behind me. Turning to see a wall of flames rapidly advancing along the corridor I just walked down. My skin singed as I ran from the fire, and I chose the corridor on my left as I dived for cover. Thankfully, another shutter door slammed shut, trapping the wall of flames on the far side. I got up on my feet and shook myself off, relieved that I hadn't burnt to ashes but terrified by the hellish situation I found myself in. The labyrinth. That's what the voice had said. Make it to the center and you'll live. I was a rat in a maze, tormented by my yet unseen tormentors. Of course, I didn't want to play their twisted games. But what choice did I have? Despite the hell my life had become, I wanted to live. I continued walking, advancing deeper into the labyrinth whilst keeping my eye out for traps. I made my way down several narrow passageways, all appearing identical to the last. I had no clue whether I was heading in the right direction or not. Come to think of it, I had no idea of how large this maze was or how I would reach the center. For all I knew, this was all just a twisted game planned by my captors, and they were simply toying with me. The fear was building inside of me, a sickness rising from the pit of my stomach. Somehow I knew something bad was coming, but I never could have guessed at the threat I was about to face. I froze when I heard it, a low, animalistic growl from the corridor behind me. I turned slowly, seeing a monstrous shape in the shadows. And suddenly the invisible speakers blared and the same mechanical voice called out to me. "Meet your competition. Only one of you will make it out of here alive." I experienced an icy cold shudder as I watched the figure approach, and I saw the monster's true form under the dim light. The horror I witnessed was impossible but yet real. There stood a werewolf, or at least a close approximation of one. The beast was over 6 foot tall, its muscular body covered in thick, matted fur. When I looked to the beast's face, I was surprised to see it had 3 pairs of eyes, all black and glaring menacingly towards me. My opponent was fast and I barely dodged the first attack. But I didn't escape unscathed as the beast's claws cut into my side. I squealed in pain and shock, but the cut wasn't deep, and so I stayed on my feet. Thrashing out with my machete, I returned the favor, cutting the beast's back and forcing it to roar in agony. Blood had been drawn on both sides, and I prepared myself for the next attack, turning to face the wounded beast. I saw the anger in its 6 dark eyes and knew it meant to kill me. One of us would surely be dead in a matter of seconds or so, I thought. but events were to intervene. The beast was about to pounce when we were hit by a powerful explosion as the wall itself was blown in. The blast threw both me and my opponent to the floor. I hit my head on the cold metal gangway and was dazed for a moment. Slowly, I regained my senses and rose to my feet, coughing and spluttering as I made my way through the dust and debris. To my astonishment, I saw a huge hole in the wall of the labyrinth, quickly filled as a motley crew tore through the gap. I ducked and rolled myself into a protective ball as a mob of bodies charged past me in a mad scramble. I saw a dozen or more pairs of feet, glancing up to see human bodies, most dressed in sparse robes or rags like me, while others were entirely naked. All were whipped up into a frenzy, their eyes filled with mad rage and a fiery determination. Most were armed with handheld weapons such as machetes or short swords, although a few carried advanced-looking firearms that I didn't recognize. A second later, and a small but deadly robotic war machine floated through the newly created hole in the wall. The drone hovered above me, observing me with its inbuilt cameras and apparently deciding whether or not I constituted a threat. I froze, expecting to be cut down at any moment, but then a hand reached out and helped me to my feet. I looked into the eyes of my rescuer and saw a hint of compassion behind a hardened exterior. The young woman who'd helped me up looked like she'd been through the wars, her face drawn and eyes tired and bloodshot. When I saw her skin, I noted deep and barely healed scars and wondered what torture she'd endured. In fact, all of the humans present appeared emaciated and bore signs of torture upon their naked bodies. And yet these people were far from defeated as they waved their weapons in the air and prepared for battle. "I don't understand," I muttered weakly. "Me neither," the woman replied. "All I know is that we're free. These Astri bastards have tortured us all and murdered our friends. Now it's time for payback." I didn't know who she was and what she meant, but reckoned I was better sticking with these guys rather than the alternative of facing an unknown enemy alone. The hovering robot seemed to be leading the mob and delivered its instructions in a monotone voice. "Follow me. I will lead us safely through the labyrinth and onto the next level." I felt a little more confident now. I had help, but in the chaos I'd forgotten about my previous nemesis, the six-eyed werewolf who'd also survived the explosion and was now back on its feet, snarling aggressively and blocking our path. I lifted my machete and prepared to fight, but the woman stopped me by placing a firm hand on my shoulder. "No," she said, "he's on our side." I looked to her in utter bafflement, but the woman remained steadfast. "Just watch," she said. We stood back as the machine advanced towards the growling werewolf. But instead of attacking, the drone communicated with the beast, speaking in what I guessed was the alien wolf's native language. This sounded to me like a series of unrecognizable grunts and growls. Nevertheless, the werewolf responded to the communication in kind, and its body language quickly changed from aggressive to relatively friendly. To my disbelief, the beast who had almost killed me moments before was now an ally. It made no sense, but I didn't dwell on the confused situation, instead joining my new comrades as we followed our robotic guide and tore down the tight corridors. Before long, we reached a solid wall, and I feared we'd made a wrong turn. But then the machine called out to us, saying, "Stand back," raising its robotic arms. The machine fired two powerful rockets which slammed into the metal wall, demolishing it in a mighty explosion which knocked me off my feet. Pulling myself up, I followed the scrum as we charged through the newly created hole and emerged into a whole new level of hell. Leaving the so-called labyrinth, we found ourselves inside a massive chamber which looked like some kind of docking bay, except the cargo were hundreds of prisoners held in stacked cages. So many frightened humans with ugly shock collars secured around their necks. But I hardly had time to take in the horror as suddenly every one of the cages opened automatically and the collars dropped off the prisoners' necks, freeing them all at once. Some were reluctant to leave their prisons, hanging back like they thought they were being tricked. But others bolted out of their cages without hesitation, crying with fury as they leapt down onto the metal gangway and armed themselves with whatever weapons they could lay their hands on. Most of the prisoners were human, but to my utter astonishment, I saw other species amongst their number, exotic aliens of various descriptions. There were several other werewolf-like creatures similar in appearance to the one I'd fought back in the maze. There were other humanoid creatures too, some tall and hairless and others short, stumpy and covered in thick fur. Most bizarre was a pink octopus-like being which slithered across the cold metal surface, using the suckers on its tentacles to propel itself forward. Despite their differences, all the prisoners seemed united in their desire to escape and seek bloody vengeance upon their captors. But who had done this to us and why? I had no time to ponder this question, but did receive an answer of sorts as the situation quickly escalated. A blaring alarm sounded throughout the chamber, and a moment later a shutter door at the far end of docking bay shot open, revealing a platoon of monstrous alien foot soldiers who quickly joined the fray. Astri, my female companion, cried, a cold terror now evident in her voice. I watched on in horror as 24 red-scaled reptilian killers armed with guns and war pikes fanned out in military formation, their cold and predatory eyes full of malice and the claws on their feet clicking in anticipation as they attacked. The gunners struck first, filling the chamber with needle-like bullets which literally tore human flesh to shreds, slaughtering dozens and spilling their blood and guts on the metallic floor. Next, the spear-wielding warriors jumped into action, charging forward and setting upon escaped prisoners, impaling them or slashing their throats with their claws. "Come on!" the woman screamed, "we've got to fight. Otherwise they'll kill us all." Her rallying cry was very effective, because the mob surged forward with a righteous fury, throwing themselves at the Astri soldiers in a desperate wave of violent attacks. The alien stormtroopers cut down dozens, but still they came. The woman and others used their stolen guns to lay down covering fire while machete-wielding humans thrashed out at the Astri. The captors were stronger and tougher, but they didn't have the numbers. One by one, the Astri were overwhelmed and cut down by furious gangs of freed prisoners. In the midst of the bloody chaos, I saw the same werewolf I'd previously sparred with jumping on top of an Astri soldier, ravaging the enemy soldier with his claws and teeth in a savage attack. Next, I witnessed the octopus-like being seize a gun from the claws of another reptilian guard with one of its tentacles. Next, it lashed out with a second appendage and suffocated the same Astri, crushing its skull in a deadly embrace. For a time I stood paralyzed, watching in horrified awe as the savage battle played out before my eyes. But I was brought back to reality when one of the reptilians charged at me, pike extended as it roared in fury. I reacted on pure instinct, using my own blade to parry the first attack. We sparred for a few moments, thrashing out at each other and dodging attacks. But the Astri was bigger, stronger, and faster than I was, and so the alien soon gained the upper hand, knocking the weapon from my hand and forcing me down to the ground. The snarling beast stood over me, holding its war spear aloft as it prepared to strike its killer blow. I closed my eyes and prepared for death, but suddenly a shot rang out. I looked up in time to see the Astri's head explode into bloody viscera, its scaled body collapsing heavily onto the hard floor. Getting to my feet, I turned around and saw my gun-wielding savior, the woman from the labyrinth who'd led the resistance. Once again, she held out her hand to help me up, which I gladly took. "Thank you," I mumbled. "You're welcome," she said with a faint smile on her dry lips. "My name's Natasha, by the way," I smirked, acknowledging the insanity of making introductions in the middle of this violent chaos. Nevertheless, I replied in kind, saying, "Nice to meet you, Natasha. I'm Jamie." For a brief moment, we rediscovered some humanity amongst all the terror and anarchy. But the bloody battle raged on around us, and so there was no time for sentimentality. By now, the Astri fighters were on the back foot. Most of their number had been butchered, while the last half dozen laid down suppressing fire to cover their retreat. The assault against them was led by the same war machine that had guided us through the labyrinth, firing rockets down upon the enemy with a ruthless efficiency. But the price paid for these gains had been a heavy one, as the docking bay was littered with the bodies of humans and other species, the bay floor splattered with their blood and guts. I was saddened to see my former nemesis amongst the dead, the six-eyed werewolf from the labyrinth. He'd fought bravely but had ultimately been cut down by a barrage of Astri bullets. In fact, almost all of the dozen escapees who'd fought through the maze with us were now dead. The carnage affected both Natasha and I, and we both stood for a moment in stunned horror before a new voice called out to us from the distance, shouting, "You too, over here." We turned to see a pale-faced and emaciated middle-aged man dressed in white robes standing in an open doorway and repeating his call, "Come here, quickly. "I can help you." We didn't know this man, but he was a fellow human being, and so I decided we needed to trust him. Sprinting, we ran through the bodies and made our way to the doorway where we were greeted by the mysterious stranger. Our would-be savior waved us inside before shutting the door behind us. We found ourselves inside of what looked like an elevator, a tight steel container which automatically rose, taking us up to the higher levels and away from the blood-soaked combat zone. I relaxed during the temporary respite we enjoyed but could not do so for long. Natasha and I were quick to survey our surroundings, noting the stern-faced man who'd called us over and invited us inside, his eyes intensely observing us while his lips remained tightly shut. But what drew our attention was the creature which cowered behind him. I instinctively jumped up when I saw it, a reptilian being similar to the Astri warriors I'd just seen, but also notably different. Its scales colored a light brown instead of red. What's more, the creature was significantly shorter than an Astri, less than 5 foot in height, and it was far less aggressive in its nature. In fact, it or he had yellow eyes filled with fear and anxiety, and I soon got the impression he was more afraid of us than we were of him. I didn't believe this being posed any threat to us, but Natasha wasn't taking any chances. In a rapid movement, she raised and aimed her alien firearm and prepared to shoot. But, to our immense surprise, the white-robed man stepped in front of the gun and cried out, "Don't hurt him. He is not Astri. This being is on our side." Natasha was shocked, but thankfully she didn't pull the trigger, instead lowering her weapon and taking a step back. We both looked upon the odd pair with bafflement, watching as the human reassured his reptilian comrade, showing him what appeared to be heartfelt compassion. "Who are you?" I asked in confusion. The man turned towards us and nodded his head before answering. "My apologies, let me make the necessary introductions. My name is Gideon. I have been a guest of the Astri for quite some time." He paused and turned towards his brown-scaled reptile companion before continuing. "And this is Abel, who I'm proud to call my friend." "Abel?" Natasha exclaimed in disbelief. Gideon smiled faintly before replying, "Yes, well, I'm afraid his true name is quite unpronounceable in our tongue. Instead, I have named him after my late brother back on Earth. I think of it as a sign of respect." I was no clearer on who this odd little man was, or what his relationship was with this strange creature. Then again, nothing which had occurred since the beginning of this living nightmare Natasha had been here longer, however, and surely received no real answers since the chaos. She continued to glare as my entire focus at the nervous reptilian like she suspected a trap. "I don't get it," she exclaimed. "If that thing isn't Astri, then what is it? Another prisoner?" "Not exactly," Gideon replied thoughtfully. "It's difficult to explain, but I will try my best. But there's something else I need to show you first. It won't be an easy thing to witness, but alas, it is necessary to experience the full extent of the horror before you can understand the truth." Natasha and I shared a look of cold terror as we considered the horrifying meaning behind Gideon's cryptic words. I was prepared to demand further answers, but a moment later our elevator came to a halt and the doors slid open to reveal a horror beyond my worst nightmares. "Welcome to the Astri's Temple of Pain, the pinnacle of their culture," Gideon said grimly as he and Abel stepped inside. It's hard for me to describe the interior of the Astri Temple, if that's the right word for it. The lighting inside was a dim shade of blood red, giving the chamber a foreboding appearance from first glance. Nevertheless, the entrance to the room was fairly unremarkable, consisting of what I guessed were the alien equivalent of pews, places for the Astri worshippers to sit or kneel whilst they participated in whatever twisted ceremonies occurred within this hellish chamber. But it was impossible to ignore the vile centerpiece that adorned the far wall. Standing above the pews in the same position one would expect to find a crucifix in a Christian church. The Astri's equivalent was surely the result of bad science, resulting in a twisted mosaic of skin and flesh, all meticulously sewn together in a sickening display. I'd seen enough death in my time to know that the horrific exhibit was constructed from real human bodies, and the foul stench confirmed this was so. And then there were the faces contained within the fleshy canvas, 13 human faces detached from their skulls and sewn into the hellish tapestry, their eyes shut but mouths still hanging open. Against my better judgment, I slowly walked down the aisle towards the sickening idol, horrified by what I saw but somehow unable to turn away from it. And then it happened. The faces suddenly came to life, their eyes opening all at once to reveal 13 lost souls, all long since overtaken by terror and madness. They glared out at us, acknowledging the presence of fresh victims to their torturous existence. And then they opened their collective mouths to reveal the utter darkness within. I don't know how they exerted any noise through their non-existent throats, but suddenly they screamed as one, a blood-curdling, soul-destroying wail which reverberated throughout the small temple, rising to a terrifying crescendo which forced me to cover my ears in a vain attempt to drown out the horror. Natasha ran to my side, screaming, "Make it stop!" I looked to Gideon and Abel, who appeared quite calm throughout the terrible cacophony. Gideon nodded to his alien friend and shouted to be heard over the screams. "Time to end this." Abel gently nodded his head and activated a control panel on the wall beside the mosaic of skin, using his thin claw-like fingers to type in a command. We heard a bleeping sound, and a moment later the screaming abruptly ended, the 13 pairs of eyes closing and the disembodied faces dropping. We held a moment of solemn silence before Gideon spoke softly, saying, "Finally, these poor souls are at peace." Natasha and I stood by in shocked silence, unable to find the words to react to the savagery we just witnessed. Once again, it was left to Gideon to offer an explanation of sorts. I used to believe the Astri were invincible, that they were so superior to us and their cruelty was akin to a sadistic child pulling the wings off a fly. I'm ashamed to admit that I once served them when I thought I had no other choice. I believed I deserved to die as punishment for my complicity in their crimes, and this was so nearly my fate. But Abel was the one who rescued me just moments before a fiery death. He paused, looking with affection upon the odd lizard-like alien. He was the one who showed me the truth and proved to me that our enemy can be beaten. After all, Abel's people know the Astri better than we ever could. "I still don't understand," Natasha interrupted. "Who is he? And what the hell is all this?" Gideon nodded his head thoughtfully, looking to his alien companion before replying. "Yes, I suppose answers would be helpful. Our time is limited, and so I will try to be concise. The true name of Abel's species has long been erased from history, although I will refer to them as the Gaians. In any event, they had the misfortune of evolving on the same planet as the Astri millions of years ago. The two races are related in a similar way to Homo sapiens and Neanderthals back on Earth, except both subspecies survived to establish their own independent civilizations. The Astri came from the savage jungles where they needed to fight against fierce predators for limited resources. Meanwhile, the Gaians lived upon the more peaceful plains, valleys, and coastlines where their civilization thrived. While the Gaians focused on science, culture, and enlightenment, the Astri developed into a cruel, warmongering race who sought to resolve all disputes with bloody violence. Abel's ancestors were certainly technologically superior to their planetary rivals, developing spaceflight when the Astri were still killing each other with muskets and pikes. They could have destroyed the savage Astri millennia ago and saved the galaxy centuries of pain and suffering. But alas, the Gaians were a peaceful and trusting people, and so they let them live. Gideon paused briefly, a faint smile on his lips but a terrible sorrow apparent in his tired eyes. "You can probably guess what happened next. The Astri betrayed them," Natasha answered angrily. "Correct," Gideon confirmed. "They used brutal violence against their planetary rivals, committing a near genocide while subjecting the survivors to permanent slavery. And the Astri also captured the Gaian spaceships and advanced technology, ultimately allowing them to expand their savage empire across the galaxy." I shook my head as suddenly this nightmare was starting to make sense to me. But there were still so many unanswered questions. "But why all this?" I exclaimed whilst pointing towards the grotesque display of now thankfully dead human faces. "What do they hope to achieve from all this cruelty?" "A very good question," Gideon answered thoughtfully whilst meeting my gaze. "And a difficult one to answer. We humans have committed horrific atrocities too, of course, both against our own species and the animals we share our planet with. Still, on some level, most human beings know the distinction between right and wrong. Not so for the Astri. I'm afraid they have no moral compass left after millennia of savage warfare and intergalactic genocide. But it's more than that, isn't it? Their violence and passion for torture has developed into a religion of sorts, a twisted cult of death built upon the pain and suffering of their many victims. At least this is what I once thought. But now I see the truth. The Astri aren't the galactic master race they claim to be. Their power is based on the terror they inflict upon their victims, but they are nowhere near as strong as we've been led to believe. This is why Abel and I created the necessary conditions for this rebellion. We shall take this slave ship from the enemy and send a message to the galaxy. They need to know that the Astri's days are numbered. I noted the passion which entered Gideon's voice as he spoke those last words and wondered what hellish personal journey he'd been on to reach this point. There were further questions I wanted to ask, but there was no time. Abel typed more digits into the control panel before walking over to his human friend and whispering in his ear. Before long, Gideon shared the latest news with us. The battle is all but over, he proclaimed, but there is little reason for celebration. Sadly, casualties amongst the prisoners have been very high. But our rebellion has succeeded. The Astri torturers and murderers have been vanquished, and all that remains is for us to seize the bridge. From there, Abel can take control of the ship and bring us home. Now, shall we? I shook my head in disbelief, looking to Natasha, who seemed to share my confusion. Could it really be so simple? Were we actually going home? I didn't know what to believe, but it seemed we had little choice but to trust the enigmatic Gideon and follow his plan. And besides, we had no desire to spend any more time in this sickening temple of death. Gideon and Abel led the way, exiting the chamber through yet another hidden door and leading us through a dark maze of twisting corridors, which seemed to be the norm inside of this bleak Astri spaceship. Before long, we reached another door leading to an elevator. The ever-resourceful Abel summoned the lift and we entered, ascending to another level inside of this enormous vessel. Once we exited the elevator, we came face to face with the bloodied survivors of the battle, a motley crew of brutalized but defiant humans sprinkled with several members of various alien species. They had little in common with each other, and even the human beings might have been mortal enemies back on Earth, but old rivalries didn't matter now. All had been abducted from their homes and even removed from their own planets by a savage alien race who'd inflicted unspeakable tortures upon them. Nevertheless, as soon as the opportunity arose, they'd fought back bravely and fiercely, winning against all the odds. And yet there was no joy in their eyes, only sorrow and pain after all they'd lost. But still, their job wasn't quite done yet, and there was one last barrier to break through before a final victory could be achieved. We pushed through the silent crowd and saw the heavy steel door, which I guessed was the entrance to the ship's bridge. We stood well back as what I assumed was the same war machine which had saved me from the labyrinth flew forward, carefully positioning itself before bombarding the barrier with high-velocity rockets, causing an almighty explosion that almost forced us off our feet. I shielded my eyes from the blast, waiting for the dust to settle before observing the substantial hole blasted through the formerly impenetrable doorway. I was still apprehensive, feeling that the ship's bridge wasn't safe, but Abel proceeded cautiously inside, his talons clicking on the cold metal as he went. Gideon soon followed, and the mob of freed prisoners went next. Natasha and I shared yet another look before she said, "After you." The bridge was brighter and more elaborate than the other sections of the ship we'd seen, adorned with control panels and monitors whose functions I couldn't even begin to fathom. Abel, however, seemed very familiar with the Astri's technology, which I suppose wasn't surprising given that said technology had once been stolen from his people. But sadly, there was another tragic twist to come. The last surviving Astri might have been the ship's captain or a senior officer. I guess we'll never know for sure. What seems certain is that he remained hidden within the control room, waiting patiently for his prey and the opportunity for vengeance. The predator moved fast, and before anyone had a chance to react, withdrawing a pistol and firing, the round hitting Abel square in the head and blowing his brains all over the control panel. Gideon responded with grief and raw anger upon witnessing his friend's death, screaming in fury as he recklessly charged at the Astri warrior, only to be hit by a second shot, his body thrown backwards by the powerful force of the impact. In that moment, the mob was consumed by a righteous anger, charging forward as one in a ruthless attack upon the Astri killer. He shot one and slashed two others with his claws before the furious prisoners overwhelmed him. knocking the alien down and brutally stabbing him with their blades. Soon the bloodbath was over as the reptilian lay dead on the cold metal floor, struck down by 100
here we
stab
are.
wounds. The last
We paid the
survivors
monster
of a
no
prisoner
heed,
rebellion
however,
in control
instead running
of an
to the
alien
side of our
spaceship
stricken
on the edge of our
companion
solar
Gideon,
system,
who was now sprawled
Poor
against
Gideon
the
was
wall.
able to communicate
Blood
limited
pouring
instructions
from a
to us
gunshot
before
wound
he
in his
lost
belly.
consciousness,
He
providing
whispered
enough
in sorrow
information
as his
for us
face
to
went
transmit
pale,
this SOS
saying,
message through space.
"I've lost another
But we have
brother."
no idea how to pilot this huge
it was
vessel,
all for
and so
nothing.
are adrift in the cold vacuum, slowly waiting for death. I can't accept that this is the end of our story, however. My comrades and I, human and non-human alike, have fought too hard and suffered too much to simply give in. I've learned so much about the enemy, but also about the complicity of our Earth-based governments in their atrocities. There are those amongst our number who remember being handed over to the Astri by fellow human beings, delivered into evil by traitors from our own species. Our transmission may well reach Earth, but we know that no help will come from there. But we have heard rumors of a third party, a galactic confederation which stands up to protect those brutalized and tortured by the monsters of this cruel universe. And so, we hope against hope that our account will reach these intergalactic saviors. If you're listening, you must reach us before the enemy does, and together we can take the war to the cowardly Astri and end their reign of terror once and for all. I repeat, SOS. Please send help. You're our final hope.